tree's up. The festivities are in effect. I think we're all set for a little bit of Christmas wrapping, don't you? As we get close to that Christmas season, well, closer than we already are, I think it's only customary that I shift gears a little and start into the real Christmas stories. Those are always the ones I save for a little closer to that special time. That way, you feel that you've got your money's worth, and there's certainly something that I can't wrap under the tree. Welcome to Cozy Horror, with me, Dr. Plague. Let's get this wrapping started, as we have a little wrap session of our own. There's always the chance you'll receive something strange for Christmas. Strange t-shirt, maybe a gag gift, one of those weird white elephant gifts you always see on the internet. But here's hoping that you don't get a gift like the one in today's story, because no one wants to be the subject of Christmas mourning. It all started with the John Doe. He had come in by ambulance at about midnight on Christmas Eve, after being found in an alley by a patrolman. He got there before I did, and sat there for most of the day, just taking up a slab. I remember feeling sorry for the corpse. Was there someone out there wondering where he was, and why he'd never come home? The police were baffled, and no one was really sure who he was or how he died. Poison was suspected, but the coroner wasn't in, and we were really just minding the shop until he came back on the 26th. I was mostly just trying to make it till 6 p.m., so I could sign off to the night receptionist and head home. It was Christmas Eve, and I really wanted to get home and put some PJs on and enjoy my evening. We only had one visitor that day, and he was easily the strangest person I'd ever seen. He came bustling in around noon, a middle-aged guy in dark clothes and an honest-to-God traveling cloak. When I saw him, I thought to myself there must be some kind of Harry Potter thing going on in town. The guy looked like an extra in one of the movies, and not one of the extras you wanted to get to know. The guy just screamed Death Eater at the top of his lungs, and when he saw me, he made a beeline for the desk as he flashed his best shark's grin. The eyes that hung above that smile, however, were the most intense I had ever seen. They looked like pools of green that dance in a lake full of ice. The kind of lake that holds monsters beneath the surface. "Excuse me, miss, I was wondering if you've had any John Does come in today." I told him I'd be happy to take a look and asked if he could tell me anything about the body he was looking for. "Oh, late 30s, dark hair, probably dressed in jeans and a plaid shirt." I was instantly suspicious because it sounded like he was describing the body that I'd been wondering about all day. I asked for ID and proof of his relationship to the deceased, but he seemed unable to produce either. He said his brother hadn't come home last night, and someone had told him about the police taking a body that had been found near their apartment, which had brought him here to check on it. I hope it's not him, but just can't stand to see our poor mother worry over him. The unfaltering grin he wore made me believe otherwise, but I told him that without proof of relationship to the deceased, he couldn't view the body. I advised that he come back with photo ID and identification, perhaps a police report, and then we could do a proper ID on the John Doe. He smiled the whole time, but I didn't really trust that grin. He had expected to just waltz in and do whatever he meant to do. Probably snap some pictures for a local tabloid or something like that. While the morgue was short-staffed for the holidays, it wouldn't have been that hard for him to do so either. But I wasn't about to play along. "Oh, I'm sorry. I should have come better prepared. I'll go home and see what I can scrounge up." He left, and I figured I'd never see him again. I wish that had been the case. The strange man came in around noon, but as I settled in to kill the second half of my day, something pinged on my camera around back. The morgue in our town isn't huge, dozen full drawers, of which about half are usually occupied, a freezer for long-term storage that holds about 3 or 4 cadavers at any given time, and 3 autopsy tables. Most of our business comes in through the rear, ambulances or hearses from the local funeral home, and the back door camera has a motion sensor, so you can tell when one of them pulls up to pick up or drop off. I wheeled over to the little CCTV monitor near the end of my desk and pushed the silent button as I checked the feed. I'd expected to find an ambulance with another drop-off, but instead I was greeted by an empty alley on the grainy monitor. The cameras were old, the feed full of snow and off-color picture, but with daylight still holding sway, it was easy to see that something was out back, but except for the dumpster and the cans we use for garbage. I figured it must have been a bird or something and went back to playing on my phone. When it chirped again, I glanced over just in time to see a shadow step out of frame. A shadow with a cape, or maybe a long cloak. I leaned in and looked at the grainy feed, trying to see where the shadow had gone, but there was nothing. Whatever had set the camera off had stepped out of sight, and I wondered if it might be a bum or something. We did occasionally get vagrants in the alley, but most of them weren't in a big hurry to hang out around the morgue. Most of them knew that lingering in a pull-in lane would get you yelled at by emergency services, and the rest were just afraid of what they might catch from the dumpster, since it was clearly where we disposed of the spare bodies. Ha ha. Seeing the shadow, however, made me think of our mysterious visitor, and I clicked around on the camera to the other 4 views we had. The cold room was clear. The autopsy room was clear. The back hall was clear. The front room was also clear. Except for me, of course. The movement sensor went off again, scaring the tar out of me, and when I flipped over to the back alley, I saw an ambulance pulling into the narrow alley. I sighed, getting up as I went to lock the front door and open the back door for them. I hate it when they don't call first, but that's the nature of business, I guess. Ralph was there, the guy who usually drives the bus for St. Michael's, with a couple of crash victims who had died en route to the hospital. They said the families will be by to pick the bodies up tomorrow. What a Christmas, huh? Sign here. I signed off on his clipboard, and the EMS loaded the bodies into the freezer drawer of the autopsy room. They were pretty banged up, but I had a little doubt that whatever mortician they sent by to get them would put them back together for the funeral. It would either be Gladys or McCann's if they were locals, and both did excellent work for the price tag. I stuck around to chit-chat with Ralph for a few minutes as he smoked, and as the ambulance rolled out of the alley, I remembered the mysterious shadow and had a look around to see if something was still hanging around. The alley was empty, other than the dumpster and the trash cans, and there was nothing that could have made the shadow in the first place. I headed back inside, having killed an hour at least watching them unload a couple of stiffs, and returned to find a surprise. 2 missed calls and a voicemail from a number that I wasn't familiar with. The voicemail turned out to be from someone named Candace, and she sounded scared, despite the upbeat holiday music playing in the background. I called her back, and she asked me to wait a moment as she stepped outside. Yes, hi, my name's Candace Guzman. My fiancé never came home last night, and she sobbed audibly before regaining her composure. I was wondering if maybe you had a John Doe come in recently? I told her we had, telling her about the man that they'd brought in last night, and I heard her make a heart-wrenching sound as I described him. She said it might be a few days before they could come and identify the body, something about needing someone to watch the children, and asked if we could please hold the body until she could come and have a look. I explained to her that the coroner wouldn't be back until the 26th, and the body would likely go into long-term storage after tonight anyway. She said she'd be there on the 25th when we opened, and thanked me for being so understanding. This is just going to devastate the kids if it's him. They really loved Terry, so much, especially after the hell their real father put them through. She hung up, and I remember hoping it wasn't him. Nobody wants to find out their stepdad is dead on Christmas. For the rest of the day, I kept catching strange blips on the camera. I would look up from my phone and see odd movement in the hallway cam, or quick and agitated motions in the back area cameras. It was like a moth or something I was catching on the lens, and more than once I thought about going to have a look. It was like being the night guard on a Five Nights at Freddy's game, and the parallels were beginning to spook me as the day progressed slowly. At 4, after glancing up a half a dozen times to find nothing, I finally went and searched the back for whatever was making the cameras wig out. The back hallway was clear, the emergency lights casting the linoleum in a sickly green color. The back door was locked, the shadows gathering in the back alley as I looked through the back window. The cold storage door was locked, but I opened it anyway and took a peek inside, finding nothing but closed drawers and a lot of condensation. My last stop was short stay, and I found the door still locked as I opened it and took a peek. All the drawers were pushed in, all the tables were still clean, and nothing seemed amiss. I didn't find any bugs or wildlife that had gotten in when the back door was open, and was forced to return to my desk and wait out the last hour and a half of my shift. 15 minutes later, though, I looked up and nearly screamed at what I saw on the monitors. The monitor in the autopsy room had detected movement, and I looked up to find a familiar man standing over one of the drawers. The body of our John Doe was lying placidly under his watchful eye, and he reached out to stroke the cheek almost tenderly. I watched as he looked up and into the camera as if he could see me. He grinned, raising his hand to wave, and that's when I brought my shaky hand down on the big red button that locked the door between the back room and the front area. I've never had to use it, but I've heard it was installed after some weirdos tried to sneak into the morgue. The mag locks could keep out just about anyone without super strength, and they would engage the lock on the back door as well. I called the police, and I must have sounded pretty frantic because they came immediately. The guy had finished whatever business he had with the John Doe and moved out of range of the camera. I hadn't seen him for close to 10 minutes by the time the police got there, and the 3 uniformed officers told me to stay back as they went through the door once I'd disengaged the button. They told me to re-engage it after they'd gone through, and for 15 minutes I stood waiting for them to come back, agonizing. I could just imagine this guy getting the jump on them and somehow getting back out here to me. He was weird enough to want to mess around with dead bodies. I shuddered to think what he would want to do to me, or the police officers, if given the opportunity. When someone knocked 3 times on the door to the morgue's hallway, I jumped and quavered out to ask who was there. "It's Officer Mathers, ma'am. We're ready to come out now." I asked if they'd found the man, and they said I must have been seeing things because there was no one back there. I opened the door after looking through the little window to verify who they were, and all 3 were more than happy to take me through each room and show me that there was no one there. I told them about the man who had come in earlier, the creepy guy who had wondered about the John Doe we had, and they took the description. Despite this, I don't think they took me seriously. They said if I saw him again to give him a call, but that they'd found no sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone having been there at all. Even the drawer that you reported open is closed. Nothing disturbed or out of place, at least as far as we can tell, Officer Mathers added. Luckily for me, my relief came in about that time, because I didn't think I could stand to be there for another second. I told him what happened, even called my boss to tell him what had happened, and went home to try to relax and enjoy my Christmas Eve. I'd like to say that's the end of it, but the real horror was what came the next day. I was woken up at about 8 o'clock the next morning by a phone call from the police. They were sending a car to come pick me up at my apartment, and they had some questions they needed answered right away. The officer on the phone was being extremely cagey, and if he hadn't started out by giving me his badge number, I would have probably thought it was a crank call. He assured me that this was very serious, and that if I didn't agree to come down to the station, I might find myself compelled to do so. So I got dressed and was indeed picked up by a police car and taken to the local precinct. I was put into a meeting room with Detective Ruckers and asked about the nature of my call to the police the day before. I told him the truth. I told him I'd seen someone in the morgue area and called the police after locking down the building. Police had come, but they hadn't found anybody. I suspected that it was the weirdo who had come in earlier that day. I gave the detectives his description, in fact. The detective was very interested in the details of the weird guy I'd seen, since now the case of the John Doe had taken a very strange turn. How could that be? He's been locked in a drawer since they brought him in yesterday. Detective Ruckers gave me a look that told me he was trying not to give me more information than I needed, but before leaving, he finally decided to throw me a bone. I'm afraid someone took him at some point yesterday and did something pretty terrible with him. I asked him what had happened. My curiosity piqued, but he said he couldn't share details of an ongoing investigation with someone who might be involved. We'll call you if we have any more questions, but I should tell you you're a person of interest and probably shouldn't leave town for the next few days. I walked out of the precinct, utterly confused. What the hell happened? Turned out I wouldn't have to wait very long for answers. The police were tight-lipped about the incident, but the news was less vague about details. It appeared that on December 25th, at around 4 in the morning, someone had broken into the Guzman's home. Mrs. Guzman, the woman I had talked to the day before, had called the police and went to lock herself and her children in their bedroom. She had no sooner left her bedroom than she heard the screams of her children from the living room. She was afraid that the intruder had done something to them and went charging into the living room to save them. What she found were her children cowering before the Christmas tree, and the body of her fiancé, Terry Russell, sitting in the armchair that he had loved so much in life. Police had arrived, but it appeared that no one had forced their way in at all. They said it looked like Mr. Russell had simply fallen out of the sky into his favorite armchair, just to give his family the worst Christmas surprise of their lives. They interviewed Mrs. Guzman, and she told the reporters that her husband had been responsible for these things. It was pretty clear that the police and the reporters were trying to get her off camera, but Mrs. Guzman was adamant that these facts be disseminated. I wondered why they hadn't cut the interview, but I supposed it made the story even more sensational when you thought about it. A distraught fiancée talking about her vindictive ex-husband after finding the body of her new love in her home on Christmas morning would probably boost their ratings for the whole year. It was Martinez. I know it. He left my Terry there for me to find, to remind me not to think I was safe. You have to protect me. Someone has to find him. As long as he's out there, this'll never stop. He was filled with presents, like some strange Santa Claus sack. He filled him up after he killed him and left him for me to find. He left him there. He left him there. He left him there. After that, I had to have answers. We didn't get the body of Terry Russell when it was released by the investigators. They were probably afraid that we would lose it again, and I never got a chance to look at the report of what had been done to him. But I wasn't without means. A friend of mine who works for the police department in my town agreed to have drinks with me. After some pleasantries, he told me all the details that were too gory for TV. He told me how the body had been stuffed with cheap gifts that were wrapped in what appeared to be the divorce papers that Mrs. Guzman had sent her ex-husband. Most of us knew Mrs. Guzman already. We've been called by the neighbors quite a few times for well checks or domestic violence claims. She never implicated Mr. Guzman, but the bruises we found on her and the kids made it pretty clear that the man had a temper. I asked my friend about Mr. Guzman, about what he looked like and how he seemed to them, and he had a lot more to say about the woman's husband than the woman. The guy was a kook. He always dressed like some kind of wizard with fancy clothes and fancy capes, and always had this look about him. I don't know how to describe it if you've never seen it, but I deal with guys who make a lot of outrageous claims about what they can and can't do. You deal with guys all the time. They tell you they're going to kill you where you stand, or how they're going to break both your arms and snap your neck the second you lay hands on them. Most of those guys are full of crap, but Martinez Guzman was the first guy I believed could actually do it. He wasn't a huge guy, but the look in his eyes made me think he was capable of violence, and maybe he was capable of other things, too. He told me that Martinez Guzman had been nowhere to be found when they arrived, if he had ever been there to start with, but the body of Terry Russell had been seated in the chair, just as Mrs. Guzman had said it would be. There was no sign of forced entry, just like it said on the news, and it was like he had just dropped out of the sky right into that chair. We searched the house first, not figuring her fiancé was going anywhere. But once we got back to the living room, we saw something out of place. There were things on the floor in front of him, things wrapped in paper that was discolored. They just kept falling to the floor as we came back into the living room, and we didn't really understand what they were until we came around the chair. He paused for a moment and took a long pull off his drink. It was one of the worst things I've ever seen. His belly had just opened up as if someone had drawn a zipper, and there were all these little paper packages lying on the ground. They were cheap things, little toys and costume jewelry, and they were all wrapped up in legal papers. We didn't even know they were divorce papers until we took them back to the station and got them analyzed. That's when we started really looking at Martinez. The papers were from a packet his wife's lawyer had mailed to him. They weren't something just anybody could have got their hands on. It was like the son of a bitch had wrapped up all these presents for him to open. Then he just put them in her fiancé. Then he'd turn the man loose to just walk home and deliver them. I asked him how the presents had gotten in there, since we hadn't even autopsied the man, and he gave me a strangely mystical look. That's the thing. There were no cuts on him. There were no incisions, no stitches, no staples. There was nothing. It was as if they had just appeared inside of him, fully wrapped, and then he'd taken them home for delivery. He took another long drink, and when he sat the glass down, he raised his hand to the barkeep to tell him to get another one. I've seen some weird shit on the force. You remember that alligator we found in the sewer, and those girls that went missing who just randomly appeared in the cornfield last year? This is beyond me, though. I don't understand it, but I believe Mrs. Guzman when she tells me that her husband is some kind of magic man. She talked about it constantly when she was at the station. She talked about how she and the kids needed protection, how they needed to disappear, how they needed to go somewhere Martinez would never find them. She was adamant about it, and most of the guys at the station think she's a nut. Looking at that and remembering the way his eyes looked any time we would interview him, I don't think she's a nut. I think she got mixed up with something bad, and I think if we don't make her disappear, we'll find her and those kids dead someday. He finished his drink in one long slurp and then excused himself, saying he needed to get some air. That was a couple of weeks ago, when the media has finally forgotten about the strange presents Mrs. Guzman and her children were delivered on Christmas morning. They may have, but I haven't. There's nothing I can do about it, except give out the description of Martinez Guzman, and hope that if anyone sees him, they'll know to stay away from him. He's a man in his early 40s, Hispanic, with short dark hair and the most intense emerald green eyes I've ever seen. He was wearing strange clothes, like a costume from a Harry Potter movie, and when he spoke, it felt like spiders running up my spine. I don't recommend that you approach him. I don't recommend that you attempt to apprehend him. For the love of God, I don't recommend that you get to know him at all. As Mrs. Guzman could attest, his presents are far from what's on anyone's Christmas list. I never quite got the talent for gift wrapping. My boxes always come out looking a little lumpy, a little bit like I let one of my kids wrap them, but that's the thought that counts, right? Christmas guests can be a real pain sometimes, especially the uninvited ones. Especially the ones that maybe take over the holiday, like the subject of our next one. So, let's settle in for some Christmas memories. I've got a bit of a weird career, but it's lucrative. People often get nostalgia over old shows from their childhood and want to watch them again. The problem is that most times, shows from before the 90s aren't well archived. These days, you can go on Amazon and buy a box set of your favorite show, but it wasn't always that way. There are whole shows that exist in little more than clips and snippets now, and some of the shows have been lost to time entirely. That's where people like me come in. We pick up VHS tapes from yard sales and Goodwill and all over the place and see what's on them. Most of the time it's useless, but sometimes you luck out and find a show that someone recorded that turns out to be some kind of lost media. If it sounds tedious, that's because it is. If it doesn't sound lucrative, think again. I paid 8 months of rent last year off a lost episode of a certain cartoon show that I found cassettes of at a church garage sale. I paid a good chunk of my student loan off with some early run episodes of As the World Turns a few years ago. The money's there, you just have to be willing to look for it. That was how I found myself going through tapes at Goodwill on the day in question. I was looking for the usual stuff. Disney VHSs, old or obscure cartoons, the hand-labeled tapes from someone who decided to record their favorite shows. Pickings were slim, and when I asked Doug, the guy who ran the Goodwill in my area, if he had any more, he got a funny look before nodding slowly. I don't think he knew what he had. Not really. That look was more akin to getting two birds with one stone. Come with me. Maybe we can help each other out. He took me into the sorting area and into the storage room beyond, where he had 6 moldy old boxes that had been haphazardly filled with VHS tapes. I can't sell them, and you're the only person who comes in who wants them. I was about to throw them away, but if you want to take them with you, then you can pitch the ones you don't want. I'd rather have the storage space, personally. I had to stop myself from salivating at the sight of all those tapes. What untold treasures might lie there? What lost media could I uncover on these? The possibilities were limitless, and I told him I'd take them from him. One thing, he said, bringing me up short before I noticed the grin. You gotta load 'em yourself. He laughed when I went to the truck and came back with a handcart. This wasn't my first rodeo. I had them in the truck in 2 trips and paid him for the other box that he had on the floor as a show of good faith. I moved them into the house and prepared to start rummaging. Ordered some Chinese food from Dante's and got comfy, preparing for a long night of treasure hunting. As I popped the first one into the VHS player I keep hooked up in the living room for, just such an occasion, I just knew that I was going to find something worthwhile here amongst those dusty old tapes. Boy, I didn't know how right I was. The VCR clicked and clacked, but gave me nothing but static and the sound of plastic tape being eaten. I quickly shut it off, taking the tape out delicately as I fed the ribbon back in. This happens sometimes with older tapes, and as the spool reset, I tried again. The label said Jeopardy, but after pressing play, delivered the same result twice more. I tossed it into a plastic bag that I had set over there for just such an occasion, and moved on to the next one. Not a great start, but I was hoping to make up for it with the next one. 5 tapes later, I had a recording of the news from October 5th, 1983, some home movies of a trip to the seashore in which a woman and a dog ran along the beach, 2 tapes that contained popular episodes of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and one of those old Disney specials they used to put on where they showcased the art process and upcoming projects. The 2 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles tapes went into the bag. They had cut the commercials, and the episodes were popular ones that you could find anywhere. along with the Disney presentation, since it had no commercials and was also well documented. I saved the news broadcasts. I have a guy that likes to collect those, and the whole movies too, for another guy who used them to make odd little art pieces online. Both tapes would probably net me less than $20, so I knew I had to find more. The next 5 were similar fare, and I added 2 more news broadcasts to the stack, a wedding video to a news stack, and 2 more broken tapes to the bag. The last of the 2 really stung because it had read Jerry's Place, and that one was hard to come across after the incident at the studio during the 2nd season. As such, any footage from Jerry's Place was worth cash money, and I dug it out after thinking that I might could take it to Daryl and see if he could do anything with it. Daryl usually cleaned and fixed VHS films, and his work was often worth the money. The next 4 hours practically flew by as I watched tape after tape of home movies, cartoons, news broadcasts, game shows, and 1,000 other things. Some of them I saved because they had shows I could sell. Some of them I saved because they had commercials that people would want clips of. Some of them I just saved because the footage would or could be used by somebody to make something. And in this business, you never knew what somebody might pay for. For the most part, I only really ended up trashing the ones that didn't work. And I'd have a full day of transferring some of them into digital media format so I could send them to people and assess their interest. As the first box came up empty, I put the bag of broken tapes into it and pulled over the second box. Right on top of the stack, the label meticulously written, was a VHS tape labeled Christmas Mourning. I picked it up and looked at it, sucking my teeth dubiously. The tape looked a little worse for wear, and it was missing those plastic glass windows that show the reels. I wasn't sure it was going to work, and when I pushed it in and hit play, it made a crunchy sound that made me even less sure. I pulled it out, the tape trying to stay behind in the machine, and I figured the filaments would break if I tried to put it to rights. It was a shame because kids opening gifts on Christmas morning was usually a favorite for creepy YouTube videos or adverts or 1,000 other things. I wound it back up, slipping it into the VCR, and when I hit play, my expectations were very low. When it played, I was pleasantly surprised. As it continued to play, my surprise would become far less pleasant. The static parted begrudgingly, and I could see a cheery living room with a Christmas tree and a floor full of presents. There was a happy, crackling fire set behind the Christmas tree, and the whole scene looked very picturesque. The date on the camera informed me it was December 25th, 1982, and it seemed from the noise behind the camera that someone was very excited. As the camera wiggled a little, I heard a small voice say, "There, it's recording," before quieting down as a man came into view. He was clearly an adult, his head hidden by an unbelievable swoop of thin blonde hair, dressed in footy pajamas like a giant child. He had put on an approximation of a kid's voice, high and wavery, and skipped happily into the scene before landing with a whump on his butt amongst the presents. "Oh, goody, goody! Lots of presents for Billy!" he trumpeted. I couldn't help but cringe a little at what I was seeing. He sounded like someone doing a bad Tweety Bird impression, and he looked up at the camera with a gap-toothed grin as if he were making eye contact with me. It was highly unsettling, and I glanced away up until I heard ripping paper and the happy gabble of the kid. It was pretty clear that he maybe wasn't all there, and I felt bad for being so uncomfortable as some parent recorded their kid's Christmas morning. It was cringy, but I didn't think there was any harm in it. He unwrapped a large stuffed dog, the fur looking incredibly soft, even through the screen, and hugged it happily as he laughed. "Aw, thank you," he said, and that's when I heard something that made me hit rewind. I had to rewind 3 times before I figured out that it wasn't just a distortion, but once I heard it, It was impossible to unhear. It was clearly someone making a weird, muffled sound out of camera, and it sounded hurt. It reminded me of someone crying out from another room, and I wished I could isolate it so I could be sure of where it was coming from. The man-child, Billy I guessed, was making so much noise over the stuffed dog that it was hard to tell, and when he grabbed up another present, I heard the sound again, followed by a muffled hushing sound. Something was off here, and it had my interest. It had never happened to me, but I had read some of the forum posts about people like me who had stumbled across odd, incriminating tapes. Sometimes it was CP or videos of murderers committing their crime, but the police usually paid money for these tapes. Sometimes certain collectors paid money for these tapes, too. Either way, the date on the camera told me that the crime was long ago, if it was a crime at all. I slid a fresh VHS into the other side, the side that records, and hit the red button. I'd just make a little copy, in case I had to turn this one over to the cops. Rent had to be paid, after all, one way or another. On screen, the man-child had opened up a flashing police car, a large package of Hot Wheels, and a few more plushies. Also some books. He was ripping them open without any real joy, but seemed to revel in showing them to whoever was on the other side of the camera, as he thanked them for the gifts. I watched as the books went into the fire, the hardbacks blackening as the flames took them. Off screen, I could hear the uncomfortable noises of whoever was on the other side, and someone was clearly crying. Someone else was trying to hush them, to console them, but it wasn't working. The man-child opened up another gift and made a face as he discovered an expensive-looking package of makeup. Yuck! Who got me this girly stuff? He threw it against the wall, breaking the package and scattering the contents across the floor. He reached for another one, checking the label before throwing it against the wall, still wrapped. He shook the next one before breaking it against the fireplace, spilling colorful clothes from the garment bag. He unwrapped another one, finding a ceramic clown which also shattered against the fireplace. Clothes, makeup, jewelry, anything he didn't like seemed to find its way into the fire or against the wall, and soon the ground was littered with glass and metal and bits of things. The man-child was gleefully flying a toy plane around, surveying the mess before tossing it against the fireplace too, and crawling off camera as he laughed. Someone screamed, the sound muffled, and he returned, dragging a girl with him by the ankle. She couldn't have been more than 15 or 16, and she was dressed in a nightgown that was now displaying an embarrassing amount of skin. She was bound and gagged, her hands tied behind her back cruelly, and as he loomed over her, I saw he had taken a knife from the floor beside the fireplace. It was a big one, almost a sword, and I could hear other muffled cries and screams from beyond the camera lens. He smiled as she wiggled and squirmed, raising the knife high so she could see it. "Time to unwrap my wheel presents," he said, his voice making it all the more horrific. I suspected that I knew what he intended to do with the girl, but as I reached for the button, it appeared that I was wrong. He plunged the knife down and into her throat, the girl bucking and shaking as he sliced. It split her chest, sliding between her breasts as it slid across her stomach and into her nethers. It slipped out of her wetly, and I could see red spreading over her nightgown. She was shaking in her death throes, and a woman could be seen dragging herself into view from off-screen. She was looking at the girl with teary eyes, trying to comfort her in the worst and last moments of her life. And that's when the man struck again. The blade came down, and she shuddered as he stabbed her again and again. The blood flew up to splatter the wall, sizzling into the fire as the woman bucked and shook her life away. The girl in the bloody nightgown was dead, her mother not far behind her, and as he freed the blade, he looked back at whoever was left and grinned gleefully. The presents hadn't mattered at all to him. This was his gift, his Christmas morning, and as he leapt out of sight, the sounds of stabbing and tussling could be heard. Muffled screams and pleas for help could be heard behind the scenes, too. They were silenced just as fast, but not before they were scarred indelibly into my psyche. He spoke not a word, going straight to his work, filled his victims with holes as the mother gave a last jerk. I sat there frozen, watching it all unfold. I was powerless to turn it off now. I had to know, I had to see, had to understand why, but I would get no answers. I was as powerless as the people he was killing, and when he came back into view, I flinched in surprise. He was naked now, his body painted in blood, and he smiled at his handiwork before turning to grab the tree. Like the Grinch had in the old storybook, he stuffed it up the chimney. He didn't get it far, but I didn't believe he was trying to go up with it. It got stuck halfway up, and the dry limbs began to burn. As the fire crept over the tree, the broken garbage that had been the family's Christmas began to catch as well. As the house burned, he turned to the camera and winked luridly. "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night." Then he reached for the camera, and the video ended. I stood there staring at the static for a long time, almost expecting to see that bloody, grinning face reflected behind me in the screen of my television. After a while, I finally found the strength to grab my phone and call the police. They took the tape, thanking me for my diligence and saying that if it helped in the apprehension of the criminal, they would see that I got a reward. The other tape I burned in the barrel out back. I didn't even want to touch it, but I wanted it in my house even less. Now I'm sitting here watching the static, trying to figure out what to do. I got 5 more boxes of tapes to go through, but the thought of watching them terrifies me. Every time I reach for them, I remember how he cut that girl open like a Christmas package and stabbed her mother to death while she died feet away. How many more tapes like that might be waiting for me? How many more Christmas mornings might be invaded by that ghoul in the footy pajamas? I don't know, but the more I think about it, the more I think it might be time to look for more honest work. I thought for a minute there was some snow coming down outside the window, but it's just rain, as usual. A little thicker than it usually is this year, but rain is rain, I suppose. Let's hope when you sit up to the table this Christmas to have your Christmas dinner, you don't end up becoming the main course. Well, if you do, though, let's hope that maybe you're as clever as the subject of our next story. So let's hear a little bit about Christmas dinner, shall we? The black limousine pulled up outside his battered tenement building. Harold saw it from the dingy window, and as he turned to shamble towards the door, he coughed wetly into his elbow. His stomach lurched, and he felt that he would undoubtedly fill his pants. Harold was old, 58 in March, and in his time he had done many great deeds. He had served in the army during World War II, fighting for his country and earning great honor on the battlefield. That was the only way a Squiresdale boy could escape this rusty trap in those days, and Harold had returned with a purple heart and the respect of his neighbors and friends. He had shaken the hand of Wilbur Wimbledon, the bloody king of Squiresdale in those days, as Wilbur told him how proud he was of his sacrifice. His rat-faced son had glowered from the front row of folding chairs as the town clapped for the 4 men who had been drafted into war and returned home. It had felt odd standing up there where he had stood with 30 other men only 5 years before, and the ones who'd come back were less and more than they had been. That day, those 4 men, Harold included, had been the talk of the town, and the Wilmingtons had tipped their hats to those heroes on that day. Harold had gone on to run the town's hardware store until his health had gotten too bad to do even that, and his son had run the place for the last 10 years. At least he had, until he'd taken his life a year ago around Christmas time. Exactly 1 year ago today, actually. There was a knock at the door, and Harold steeled himself as he solidified his bowels. He had a job to do tonight. Harold had one last good service for this town, and he couldn't fail to close up loose ends. He was an old man, but maybe an old man was just what was needed for this last piece of work. Harold plucked at the envelope from the mantelpiece, sliding it into his jacket pocket as he went to answer the door. A tall man in a black suit was waiting for him. He seemed almost bored with the task before him, his smile the perfunctory mask of a servant doing a job. Harold nodded to him and let himself be led to the limousine as the faces of his neighbors watched like silent parishioners in some macabre ritual. In many ways it was a ritual, the ritual that had been carried out since the city's founding, and Harold was just one more sacrifice before the altar of tradition. Harold stared out the window of the limousine as it carried him away from his home, a home that he'd never see again. One way or another, this would be his last Christmas. The Wilmington family owned Squiresdale. I don't just mean they owned the land. They did. But it's more important that you understand how the Wilmington family owned the town. The Wilmingtons had owned Squiresdale since its founding, in the same way that their forebears had owned slaves. They owned everything inside the town, people included, by way of owning every loan and mortgage given out by the bank, and everyone knew it. They hovered over the town like a vampire bat, their palatial estate sitting on Wilmington Hill, which overlooked the whole valley. All one had to do was look up to remember their presence. Jacob Wilmington, Claire Wilmington, and their 2 children, Barbara and Zachary, would occasionally come down to mingle with the commoners. Their visits were usually treated like visits from foreign dignitaries, or the arrival of a plague victim. The Wilmingtons only came into town for one reason. They came to choose who would be their guest for Christmas Eve dinner. The snow fell softly on the sidewalks and pitter-pattered lightly on the asphalt as the limousine sped through the town. On the sidewalks and in the shops, people went about their daily lives, shopping for last-minute Christmas gifts or sharing a moment with those they loved. As the limousine rolled by, they all looked up from what they were doing, like frightened rabbits marking the passing of some predator. They all knew they would never see its passenger again, and they were of 2 minds about it. They silently hated the Wilmington family as they watched the black limousine roll by, but they were also thankful, something that shamed them greatly. They couldn't help it, though. Men and women were always thankful when the blood on the floor wasn't theirs. Thankful it wasn't their neck in the noose this time. Thankful it wasn't someone they loved. Harold watched their faces go by in silence. Friends, longtime customers, people he'd thought of as family, rolled by like mournful spirits in the wake of the tinted windows. Now they were nothing but hollow ghosts that marked his transition as they might mark the scuttling of a bug. He had ceased to be people to them, whether they would admit it or not. He was just meat. He was a means to an end, a sacrifice that must be paid, lest their way of life might be impacted. They would thank him in their secret hearts once he was gone, but for now, they only marked his passing, and were glad it wasn't them. Harold looked nervously around for Sophie, and was glad that he didn't see her. This was no place for a child. He didn't want her to remember him as a face staring out of a window as he cruised by, either. Harold wanted her to remember him a little better than that. He wanted her to remember her grandpa as he smiled on her birthday, or laughed warmly as they sat together. Not like this, and certainly not as the phantom he would become later. When she thought of her grandpa after he was gone, he wanted her to feel pride in what he had done. The limousine passed the last of the Main Street storefronts. Then it was on its way up. The car took a significant upward turn as they began to climb up Wilmington Hill. The hill, which might as well have been the Wilmingtons' driveway, went up and up and up, circling around as they went to the very top. Harold sat like a gargoyle in the back seat, watching the town grow smaller and smaller as the limo climbed. He would soon be there, no backing out now. Whatever would be, would be. The limousine paused before the wrought iron gate that marked the beginning of the Wilmington estate. The heavy iron monstrosity was needless, of course. No one would have dared try to enter the Wilmington estate, and the few who did were never heard from again. But such a gate and the miles of fence around the estate were just another part of the appearance. The driver pressed a button on the sun visor, and the gate slid open to admit them. The Wilmingtons had kept up the tradition of Christmas Eve dinner since the town's founding. On Christmas Eve, they would choose one resident to be their guest at the spacious manor for the evening. At first, it had been an honor to take the wagon up to the old manor house. The citizens believed that the benefactors were giving their guests jobs, or even letting them stay inside the palatial house as guests. This theory lasted a few years before the truth became known one Christmas Eve. No one left the mansion once they were invited. Not after the incident. The trees slid by on either side of the limousine as it cut through the surrounding forest like a black serpent. Harold took it all in apathetically, wondering if Jonathan Harker looked at the forest around Dracula's castle in much the same way. He was traveling through the domain of a monster, and the picturesque forest and falling snow could do little to blunt that understanding. Harold was going to his death. Everyone knew it, but perhaps it wouldn't be in vain. At least he could save Sophie. That much he had done. They had been walking together when the black limousine crawled into town. Sophie lived with her aunt now, but Harold still took her on little trips now and then. Trips to the toy store, trips to the park, or just trips around town so the two could watch the leaves change or the snowfall. Sophie loved the trips out with her grandpa, and Harold looked forward to spending time with his only grandchild. Lisa hadn't wanted him to take Sophie into town that day. You know this is the time of the year when they come to choose the guest for Christmas Eve. Harold knew that. How could he forget? But he had begged her to let his granddaughter go Christmas shopping with him. We might get some flowers for her mother and father's grave, he said, and finally Lisa had relented. They'd been walking towards the flower shop when he had seen them. The limousine came rolling around the corner like a big black cat, and Harold's actions had been purely reflexive. He had pushed Sophie behind him as the limousine rolled by, but not fast enough. Jacob Wilmington, the son of that rat-faced Carver Wilmington who had sneered at Harold as Mr. Wilmington Sr. had admonished him, rolled down the window. He had pointed at the little girl, and his smile was dazzling. It was the smile of a senator trying for re-election, or an undertaker trying to sell a new coffin, and he pointed at her as he asked her to come closer. She'd shaken behind her grandfather like an autumn leaf preparing to fall, but Harold had already made up his mind. He pushed her behind some nearby trash cans, and the crowd had pressed close to hide her from view. Sophie had remained unseen, and he'd stepped forward instead. Mr. Wilmington had looked puzzled, unsure of what had happened, but he smiled all the same and told Harold how he'd be honored if he'd come join his family for Christmas Eve dinner this year. "I can promise it'll be an evening that you'll never forget," he said, as the limousine rolled along, and Harold watched his doom roll with it. And just maybe, though, as a plan came to mind, he might make it a Christmas Eve that they'd never forget either. It would be kind of like the one Christmas, the one people talked about in hushed tones, the Christmas Eve when the whole show had become this new macabre ritual. It was Christmas Eve, 1937, and the town was just settling down for bed when the scream echoed through it. Terry Hatchett had been that year's honorary guest, and when the town car had come to get him, he'd worn his finest suit and a pair of loafers he'd bought from the general store. That was when Harold's father had owned the general store, and the shoes had come all the way from Germany in a special box. He'd left the town looking his best, a fine representation of what Squiresdale had to offer. Harold's father had been closing up shop, preparing to go upstairs for his own Christmas, when the Hatchet boy had come running down the street on a froth. Terry had been excited to be chosen. He told everyone that he'd see people who'd gone before him, all 8 years of guests, and he'd tell them how proud everyone in town was of them. Until that night, they'd all thought it was a great honor to be asked up the hill to work for the Wilmingtons. What else could they be going up there for, after all? Harold had come to the window, just a boy of 13, and saw Terry running flat out with his feet crunching in the snow. Terry's coat was gone, his pants were in tatters, and his arms were bloody ribbons of ripped flesh. He looked like he'd seen a monster, a ghost, and Harold saw the terrifying desperation on his face as he glanced at him on his way by. He never forgot that, the look of exquisite fear that fell upon him like a long cloak. As a boy, he would often dream about Terry's face and wake up screaming. As a man, he would see that same look on the faces of the men who were about to die from the bullets of the Germans, and came to realize why Terry had looked so scared. Terry was running for his life. Behind him came a pack of baying hounds, and a group of men armed with rifles. One of them shot Terry as he ran past, and Harold had seen the bright flower of blood that splattered on the snow. Terry had fallen in the snow, painting it red. As he crawled up the snow-covered streets, the men had come to collect him. Harold's father had gone out. Lots of people had gone out. And as one of the men pulled down his scarf, they saw that it was Mr. Wilmington, Sr. Mr. Wilmington offered no excuses, offered no apologies. He just looked at the gathered people in a daring way and threw the body over his shoulder. He had said more with that look than his words ever could. "This is my town, and I do as I like," that look had said. He'd hauled Terry back up to the house, and no one had seen him again after that. The thing Harold hated the most was that no one had done anything. No one had fought. No one had left. There'd been no outrage. Nothing was done. Nothing was said. The people went back to their homes. Life went on. People kept going up to the house for Christmas Eve. They didn't really have much of a choice, and the few who resisted were taken quietly in the night. The town kept the secret. The town kept quiet. The town kept living. "Sir, we've arrived." Harold shook himself out of his daze and looked up the winding steps of the Wilmington Manor. The palatial home was a sprawling granite edifice of columns and windows. From the inside it looked cheery and picturesque. As he stepped from the limousine, Harold's feet crunching in the snow, he had to remind himself that this place was a haunted house, a place of horrors. Hopefully, Harold would be the last spook to take up residence here. As he went up the steps, he was racked by a coughing fit again, and pulled his hand away bloody when his coughing had subsided. He glanced back to the driver to see if he had noticed, but that worthy hadn't even offered to help him up the stairs. He was just as arrogant as his masters, precisely as Harold had counted on. Jacob Wilmington opened the front door as Harold came to the top of the stairs, and the air that poured out was like a furnace. "Why, Harold Stobbs, come in, come in. We've been expecting you." His voice was rich, like a game show host trying to get you to solve the puzzle. He put an arm around Harold as he came in, and Harold tried not to flinch. He was in the trap now, and now was his opportunity not to tip his hand. He needed them to take the bait, and take it all in one bite. Mr. Wilmington took him through an elegant entryway and towards a grand living area larger than Harold's entire apartment. At the last minute, however, he steered him through a small door and into a modest sitting room, at least by their standards. Harold was seated in a big wing-back chair, as Mr. Wilmington sat across from him on a cream-colored sofa, a piece that had likely cost more than the rent for Harold's apartment. He smiled that senator's smile at him, as the two sat alone in the shadowy little room, neither of them sure what to say to the other. It was plain that Harold wouldn't beg for his life, or shout at him like the others had, but his silent acceptance was clearly off-putting to the man. When a man in a suit brought his drinks, Mr. Wilmington seemed relieved for the distraction. He offered one to Harold, who took it and swirled the liquid around in the crystal tumbler. It was bourbon, he could tell by the smell, and as Mr. Wilmington lifted a glass to him, Harold raised his own with none of the shake he had expected. Mr. Wilmington offered a toast to Harold's good health, and Harold offered one to his host's good taste. The two drank, Harold shuddering as he felt the fire enter his stomach. He wondered if Catherine had been offered a drink, too, before they killed her. "Oh, before I forget," Harold said, sliding a shaky hand into his coat pocket, "I brought a little gift, something for your family." "Oh, you didn't have to do that," Mr. Wilmington said, sounding touched by the gesture. The good nature didn't go past his lying lips, and certainly didn't come close to his eyes. The man was amused more than touched, amused in the way that you might be amused when a dog brings you a ball on the first throw. Ultimately, that's all Harold was to these people, a momentary entertainment for people with nothing better to do. "I just wanted you to know how much this means to me to be able to pay you back for even a fraction of what you've done for this town," Harold said, as he laid the envelope on the table. His hands shook as he did so, and his fingers released the envelope as it still hung over the surface of the antique table. His glass tumbled to the floor, but didn't break as it spilled its contents onto the rich carpet. His words came out furry, muzzy, and his tongue felt like it was getting heavy already. Mr. Wilmington looked at the envelope, puzzled for a fraction of a second, and then the sitting-room door opened as his wife and 2 children entered. They were all dressed in their best, the son in a black suit like his father's, the little girl in a sparkly gown like her mother. As the 4 arrayed before him, he could see the hands held guiltily behind their backs. Harold felt woozy. Sedatives had a way of doing that, he thought. As he began to settle into paralysis, Harold thought of Catherine again. She had probably sat in this same chair as she waited for her own death to come. Catherine. Catherine had been a rare flower growing in this dung heap. For Catherine and his son, it had been love at first sight. They'd been together since the first day of kindergarten, her hand in his when she got scared. Duncan had never balked her with the usual little boy superstition about cooties or girls being gross. He had loved Catherine, and had always been there to protect her. When they officially began dating in high school, their love was only a secret to the 2 of them. Catherine, however, had other suitors who would have loved nothing more than to see Duncan gone. Chief among them was Jacob Wilmington. He had seen her in town, visited the coffee shop she worked at every day just to pass a few words with her, and eventually tried to court her in his rich and less than subtle way. Many women would have been swayed by the pull of the Wilmington fortune. To Catherine's credit, she had eyes only for Duncan, though. Catherine had been the kindest woman Harold had ever known. Harold's wife had passed away when Duncan was barely out of diapers, and he thought of Catherine as the woman his son had been waiting for since then. They'd had 10 wonderful years together, and Harold had always been welcome in their home. When Sophie had been born, their family seemed complete. The shadow of Jacob Wilmington, however, never quite left their home. Jacob had been furious when she declined his proposal, days after Duncan had given her his ring. He'd sworn it would be the last mistake she'd ever make. Harold was sure that Jacob had wanted to choose Catherine that very year, but his father forbade it. Carver Wilmington, the rat-faced man on the bandstand, had said such an act would be spiteful as much as it would be shameful. He'd said it loud enough for the Commons to hear one December, when he refused to stop for Catherine as they stood by the corner on their way home, and chided his son for thinking such a thing was proper. "Such as you would tarnish our traditions. I weep for the day you take my place as head of this household." But, Harold supposed, Jacob had his revenge now, didn't he? When Carver passed 2 years ago, Jacob had made his choice clear. His children were the same age as Sophie, but it seemed that time hadn't softened Jacob's grudges. He'd come to the house that year, showed up on their doorstep, and personally invited Catherine to Christmas Eve dinner. She'd declined, thinking she had some choice in the matter, but she had overestimated Jacob's love for her. Sitting in their living room with Sophie, Harold had known that she had no such option, and heard clearly Jacob's veiled threats. Duncan had come out then, railing and threatening, but Jacob had made it very clear that his invitation was not negotiable. "Either you join my family for Christmas Eve dinner, Catherine, or your whole family does." She'd gone meekly when the time came, and she'd never been seen again. Duncan had hung himself 6 days later, on New Year's Eve, and sealed the desolation of his family. Harold had often had doubts about that. The Wilmingtons had proven that they could snatch people in the night over years of Christmas Eve snatchings. How hard would it have been to make his son's death look like a suicide? Harold had watched the same monster that sat across from him now sit across from Duncan and accept all his verbal abuse with a smile on his face. How much rage had swam beneath that mask, though. A hard slap rocked his head, and he momentarily came out of his daze. Jacob Wilmington's grin was less sensational than it had been a minute ago. Now it looked like something on a mental patient in a sanitarium as he crouched over Harold's chest with a knife in his hand. It was a big silver butcher's knife, its handle inlaid with gold and runes, and Jacob probably thought it symbolic or something. Maybe his father had even used it. Hell, his father's father. But to Harold, it was just another knife, suitable for only one job: killing. "We didn't want you to miss the party, old man. We wanted you awake for the last few moments of your life." The children, in their haste, were cutting his arms to the bone and looked up at him gleefully as they did so. Their cherubic smiles and polite town manners were cast aside. Now they stood as grinning imps who knew only how to cut and torture. Jacob Wilmington's knife slid along Harold's cheek, and though he didn't scream, he could feel every cut as it ground against him. Mrs. Wilmington cowered behind them, however, unsure of her place. The others barely noticed, though Mrs. Wilmington had been from some old money elsewhere, likely elsewhere where these sorts of things are still considered barbaric instead of traditional. A white-hot pain lanced across his face as one eye went dark forever. Jacob, the bastard, had wrenched it out with his hands, and now he threw it into the fireplace as Harold watched with his dying breath. "Don't worry, Harold. We'll get your granddaughter next year. Then both your line and hers will be extinguished from this town forever. What do you say to that, Harold?" he asked, as he dragged the knife over the old man's throat. Harold watched the blood patter onto Jacob's upturned face, and with his dying breath, he whispered his final words into that lunatic grin. "I doubt it." Then everything went blissfully black, and Harold went to whatever fate awaits us all. The Wilmingtons pushed back from the table, Jacob dabbing in his mouth with clear satisfaction. It was one of the best Christmas dinners he'd ever eaten, better by far because it had come at the life of an enemy. The Staubs had taken something from him, and Jacob had sworn that he would never forgive and never forget. Catherine should have been his, had been his at the end, hadn't she? And for Duncan Staub to take his own life and steal the pleasure away from Jacob was unthinkably selfish. Duncan had been his to end, his greatest enemy, and then for Harold Staub to take away the privilege of killing his last blood descendant. Harold had needed to pay too, and now he had. He looked across at Clara and saw that she hadn't eaten her dinner. Her salad, yes, her soup, yes, but her meat sat untouched. She had always been like this. Father had indulged her. If she doesn't want to participate, Jacob, then she doesn't have to. This is a Wilmington tradition, after all. But Jacob would have none of it. He'd forced her to eat some of Catherine, hadn't he? Now she turned her nose up at the rituals of his family again. "Clara, you haven't touched your meal," he said icily. Zachary yawned, his plate clean, but Jacob ignored him as he wiped a piece of bread around to get the last of his dinner. Clara jumped, taken out of whatever silent thoughts she'd been thinking, and looked at him with clear fear. I wasn't hungry," she blurted. "You know, the ritual always turns my stomach, dear. I can't stand the blood," she said, wrinkling her nose at the thought. An excuse. But an excuse he would let her keep until they were alone. He knew better than his father. She would eat her dinner. "Well, since you're not hungry," he flicked the letter at her, "why don't you see what old Harold brought us for Christmas?" Barbara was fidgeting in her seat, making small, unhappy noises as she clutched her stomach. Zachary had bent over the table and was quietly snoring in a pool of gravy he had spilled. Jacob felt his own stomach do a little flip, but that was normal. Human stomachs were not used to such rich meat as this, and he knew it would pass after his bowel movement later that night. Clara picked up the letter, stained a little where it had fallen onto her plate, and opened it with a shaky hand. The letter was large, 3 pages, and she read it aloud in her trained and cultured voice. Last Christmas, you took my son and my daughter-in-law from me. More than that, you took away the love of a family, something I will never see again. So this year, I bring a gift to you, a gift you can share with the whole town. I bring you—" She paused and looked at Jacob, unsure whether she should read the next part or not. "Well?" her husband prompted. "I bring you the fall of the Wilmingtons." She paused again, but then read on, unable to stop herself. "When I was in the war, we were stationed in a part of Germany known as Das Alte Land. It was called so because they kept the old ways and the old gods that were as strange to us as they were to many of the Nazi forces. You see, they were cannibals in the woods, old hill people who came out and attacked towns so they could take meat back in worship of their dark gods. They would eat the townspeople, crack their bones and drink the marrow, but only in the winter months. If this sounds familiar, it's because your family is likely some branch of that particular tree. You don't do it out of respect for the old ways, though. You do it because you've always done it. You do it because you're greedy and like the power it gives you over Squiresdale. But the people of one small town knew of a way to stop you, a punishment that certainly fits the crime." Jacob was cold as she read it, and for the first time in his life, he felt real fear course through him. Zachary grunted in his sleep, but Jacob thought it might be a little watery for his liking. As he looked over at his only son, he saw the tablecloth stained with long runners of red liquid that had come leaking out of Zachary's mouth. Barbara was crying now, big silent tears as she wiped at them with arms that came away streaked with red in long crimson tracks. He touched his own eye as something slid from it, and his fingers came away wet and red. They chose one person, das Elder Opfer, and sent them from the village when they knew the cannibals were coming. The person would usually volunteer, and often it was someone old or sick who knew they weren't going to survive the winter anyway. They made a sacrifice for the good of the community, Jacob, something as foreign to you as the idea of mercy. The cannibals would find and devour the person, but as they ate the flesh, the trap would be sprung. When they consumed the meat, they took a concoction of many different poisons inside them. I won't bore you with its mixture in your last few moments of life, but it's quite hard to get all those ingredients in the state, and they were very costly to the mixer. I acquired the necessary ingredients after you invited me to dinner, and the concoction was brewed and drank not an hour before I finished writing this letter." Barbara had stopped crying now. Her head was face down on the table, and as her mother had been reading, Jacob had received a front-row seat for his own fate. She had bled from the eyes, from the ears. Her tongue had swollen in her mouth, choking her, and her last few cries had been gurgles of sheer terror. Zachary had stopped breathing before his sister, and now lay in a puddle of his own blood. Jacob wondered how long he had before the blood came oozing out of him as well. He could already feel the red tears beginning to slide down his face, but he was powerless to stop his wife from finishing. "You see, it has to be timed just right. Otherwise, the poison will eat its way through the stomach of the drinker and kill them most painfully. The eating of the stomach lining, however, is what brings it into the blood, which ensures that it will taint the meat and be ingested by the target. I've only guessed that you eat those you invite to your house, but seeing what I saw in the war, I'm very sure of my guess. I would wish you one final hope as you lay dying." Jacob pitched forward, convulsing a little as his eyes ran with blood. He vomited, expectorating thick red fluid that swam with undigested dinner. His tongue swelled up to block the rest of the spew as it came up, and the rest flowed into his lungs as Jacob choked on his dinner. As he fell into a pool of his own sick, twitching in his death throes, his wife finished the last of the letter. I pray I made for a Christmas Eve dinner you'll never forget. And that was how on December 24th, at 10:07 p.m., Mrs. Clara Wilmington reported the death of her husband, Jacob Wilmington, and their 2 children, Zachary and Barbara Wilmington. She told the state police about the years of torture, the years of murder, the years of cannibalism, and the sacrifice of Harold Staub. And you, constant reader, can be sure that it was a Christmas that no one in Squiresdale ever forgot. Dang it. I ran out of labels. But while I run out and get some more, why don't I leave you guys with a story to keep you occupied while I'm away? It is truly a season for music, Christmas time. But, as we all know, not all Christmas carols are created equal. So let's settle in and hear our own Christmas carol. The man with the wagon came every year, and his arrival was something we looked forward to when I was young. He always sat up in the fountain area of the little mall in my town. He ran a little show similar to the likes of Leonard Bernstein's animatronic choir, or other such holiday entertainment that sometimes came to small towns. I always got excited when I went to the mall and saw the colorful wooden caravan parked in the lot. I would get further excited when I saw the green tarp that he used like a stage curtain to block off his setup. It was like a herald of the season to see that green tarp, and it just didn't feel like Christmas until I knew that the man with the funny tree was going to be there. I grew up in a fairly rural town, but most towns had some kind of mall in the 1990s. Ours was nothing grand, one of those barely holding on kind of places that was extremely dependent on the J.C. Penney and the Burlington Coat Factory that occupied the larger spaces. In the middle, there was a food court, a couple of bookstores, some clothing stores, and a Spencer's Gifts that the little Bible-thumping community always seemed to be trying to get closed down. The mall was the place we all used to hang out, a safe environment where you could go and peruse the edifice of capitalism. Nothing bad could happen to you in the mall. At least, that's what we thought at the time. The man in the wagon always came the week before Thanksgiving. I say he drove a wagon, but that doesn't really do it justice. What he had was a large, colorful wooden house on wheels, something like an RV that was pulled by mules. It was covered in bright colors and strange symbols, and my mom told me that he'd been coming to town for years. He used to set up in the town square, from what she told me, and every year he had some different display, though the content was always the same. When the mall opened, he began to go there instead. It was where the people were, and the people were what he was after. He used to have a manger scene, and before that it was a bunch of snowmen, but it was always just a platform for the singing heads, Mom would say. Yeah, you read that right. The singing heads. The tree that was used was large and seemed to be made of fiberglass, though I suppose it could have been something else. It was about 15 feet high, and in sections that he would drag out of the cart to erect. Once he had the tree in place, he would push out a rolling cart with a tarp over it, and we all knew that that's where the funny heads were. You never saw where he unpacked them from. You never saw how they worked, but we all knew what they did. On the first day of December, he would unveil his show. The first time the curtain slid back, we would all laugh and cheer at the sight of the tree with the funny heads covering the limbs. There were 15 in all, and they all hung from the limbs of the tree like ornaments. Each head seemed to know its part, and the songs were always expertly performed. I assumed they were robotic, because when they weren't singing, They would close their eyes and almost appear dead. There were 5 that sat on the bottom row, 4 that sat on the second row, 3 in the middle, 2 on the second row from the top, and a single head that sat at the very top like a grotesque star. They sang the usual holiday fare: Frosty the Snowman, chestnuts roasting on an open fire, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and even the religious songs that kept them in the good graces of the people who were constantly trying to get the Spencers closed. Each show lasted about an hour, and he usually did about 5 a day. He would post the show times on a chalkboard near the ticket booth, and in between shows, he could be seen sitting on the edge of the stage and whittling. The town always offered to put him up in a hotel, thanking him for bringing some holiday cheer to the community, but he always refused and insisted on sleeping in his wagon. "I wouldn't want to be away from my stars for too long," he would say with a sly wink. The man in the tree and the singing heads would stay until the day before Christmas Eve, and then they would disappear just as quickly as they had arrived. We never knew where they went back to, just that he would be back on the last week of November, and he always was. The man was mysterious, but the talking heads in the tree were the real show, and the real mystery, I suppose. The man who had assembled the chorus was just as mysterious as they were. He was middle-aged, but I suppose he could have been older. He wore a coal-black suit like an undertaker, and had a tall black hat that completed the mortician look. He had a cane, shiny black shoes that he'd polished to a mirror shine, and I always remember that he had the one tooth that winked when he smiled. He was always jolly, and his short white beard reminded me a little of Santa Claus. He always had candy canes for the children who came to see the tree, and there always seemed to be something a little off about him. Even as a kid, my attention held by the tree of singing heads, I remember keeping a wary eye on the man as he grinned and watched the show from the ticket booth. It was the same wary attention that I would give people who stood a little too close to children's playgrounds or mumbled to themselves on park benches. It was the same wariness that we give people who might not be all there. I looked forward to the arrival of the man in his cart probably longer than I should have. The mystery of the tree and the singing heads would persist until I was nearly out of high school, though I wish now that it had lasted forever. I might be happier if it had remained a mystery. I was 17 and working at Hot Dog on a Stick when I smiled as I saw the old man pushing his trolley towards the fountain area. He had the bottom part of the tree perched precariously on his hand truck, and I just knew that soon the mall would be filled with the sound of the holidays. Carol, one of my co-workers at the stand, snorted and said she couldn't believe they let that creepy old guy come back year after year. I looked shocked, but then I remembered that Carol's family had only moved here 2 years ago. They'd come up from Gladstone, a bigger town about 3 hours up the road, and this would only be her second year seeing the man and his caroling heads. "He's not creepy," I insisted, though I didn't quite believe it myself. "I love his Christmas show. Most people in town do." "Really?" Carol asked. "How long has he been coming around?" I assumed he was newish since, he's clearly trying to cash in on the whole animatronic fad. "Since I was a little kid," I told her. "He's been coming around for at least the 17 years I've been alive. Mom says he's been coming around longer than that." Carol made a halfway interested noise, and we watched as he took several trips back and forth to the wagon, as he set up his tarp and began setting up the tree. Other people had taken notice too, and there was an air of excitement as they marked the old man's return. I call him the old man, but he always looked exactly the same. He could always have passed for middle age, but he never seemed to get any larger or smaller. Other than his white beard, he never seemed to gray or wrinkle as the old-timers sometimes did. People watched him as he came back and forth, and as the top of the tree rose above the tarp, we all secretly waited for the first week of December. I was especially excited this year. I would have a prime seat for nearly every performance as I stood here and sold lemonade and hot dogs on sticks. I'd been happy to take the job after being let go from the shoe carnival when they closed, and part of it was because I knew I'd be able to watch the Christmas tree and the singing heads. The man still gave me the creeps, though I'd hidden it deep for as long as I could remember, but I looked forward to the show nonetheless. I couldn't wait to see if he had added any new Christmas songs this year, and Carol likely got tired of my constant speculation. Carol seemed less than excited, but was definitely interested to see what the old guy would bring to the table this year. I was working the first day that he opened the curtain, and to my surprise, they had added not a new song, but another head. There were 16 now, the bottom row holding 6, and it threw off some of the symmetry that had existed for years before. The man took the stage and made a bow, telling everyone he was glad to see them for another year. Then he lifted his conductor's baton and started the show. All the heads opened their eyes as if they'd only been waiting for a signal, and as they broke into a rendition of "O Come All Ye Faithful," Carol gave a long shudder, said she didn't know how she was going to work here for the next 4 weeks with all that going on. "Are you kidding?" I asked. "We get a front row seat for every performance. We don't have to buy a ticket or anything. It's kind of cool." She gave me a look like I might be brain damaged. "Tell me this doesn't seem normal to you." "Well, yeah, it's a yearly thing. The cart rolls in, the man sets up, and then the first day of December he brings out the singing heads, just as he did the year before." She pursed her lips like she was trying to find the most diplomatic way to say what was on her mind, and finally decided on the truth. "You know that nowhere else does anything like this, right?" I furrowed my brow, having never thought about it before. "I mean, they must do something like this. I'm sure there are weird little holiday activities in every town." "Yeah, but nothing like this. This is just sick. Who makes robot heads that sing Christmas carols? The whole thing it's like a Twilight Zone episode. I don't know how any of you guys enjoy this," she said, going back to counting sticks. I just shook my head as some fella came up to buy a hot dog on a stick and found my eyes wandering back to the show throughout the day. We did amazing business that month, thanks in part to the people coming over to get snacks before the next show. The man put on 5 shows a day, and the last one ended about 10 minutes before the mall closed, and he always packed his heads back on the dolly and wheeled them out after the crowd had left. I remember wanting to talk to him, tell him how much the show meant to me, but I couldn't quite bring myself to. Even as an adult, at least that's how I thought of myself, I was still a little hesitant to approach him. I remember the way he made me feel as a kid, the polar opposite of the singing heads, and always watched him shuffle back to his cart from afar. It was December 21st, 4 days before Christmas, when I learned something about the show that would change my memories of it forever. Carol and I were, once again, manning the stand when a camera crew came up to talk to the man in between shows. He was preparing for the final show of the night, tickets already beginning to sell, when a lady from Channel 4 News approached the booth and asked him if they could get an interview for a piece they were doing on the mall. He tried to put her aside gently, saying that he had the show starting in about 30 minutes, but she persisted until he agreed to do an interview and finally walked off with her. As we watched him leave, Carol got a strange look in her eye and seemed to be planning mischief. "Hey, let's go get a closer look at those heads." My mouth came open a little bit, and I asked her if she was crazy. No one got near the stage. No one. The man's demeanor was usually jolly, but anyone who tried to get close to the stage saw a different side of him come out. He could be scary, if the mood took him, and those who attempted to touch or get close to his singing heads discovered that the hard way. He'd never hurt anyone, not that I'd ever seen, but he definitely made them change their minds through some kind of sorcery, I guess. Even the surliest of teens or the brattiest of kids quailed beneath his softly spoken words and his harsh glares, and very few people attempted to go near the stage. No one goes near the stage, I told her. Yeah, 'cause he's always guarding it. He stepped away, so now we can go have a look. She explained it as if she were talking to a child, and I felt the same as I repeated to her that no one went near the stage. Pfft, come on! Aren't you a little bit curious to know what they are and how they work? It's got to be something with the baton, maybe some kind of advanced robotics, if they can sing all those songs. I don't see any wires from here, do you? He's got to be some kind of skilled tinkerer if he's controlling them with nothing but that cheap plastic wand. Don't you want to see how it works? I did. I was very curious, but it seemed wrong to look. It was like knowing how a magician did his trick, and it might take some of the magic out of it if I knew that the rabbit had been in that hat the whole time. Come on, she said. What, are you scared? She was moving before I could answer, and I just got swept up in it. I wasn't scared, not really, but I didn't want her to go by herself either. I was honestly worried that if she was alone, I would never see her again. She'd become one of my best friends in the time that we'd worked together. We hung out outside of work, and we went to the same school together too, and I liked Carol, and that way we sometimes become attached to people. I really didn't want anything to happen to her, and after tossing down a back in 10 minutes sign, I followed behind her. The crowd was sparse this early, just a couple of people wanting to get good seats for the last show of the evening, and it was easy to move behind the curtain and into the shadowy area backstage. The light came in from overhead, but the curtain still cast the bottom part of the tree in a small shadow bank. The heads looked a little grisly with their eyes closed, seemingly asleep, and now that I was close, they looked less magical and more creepy. He had decorated his Christmas tree with severed heads, it appeared, and now that I could look at them properly, I could see that they were hanging from their own braided strands of hair. They swung from the boughs like hanged men and women, and Carol seemed amazed by them. Wow, she said, getting right up to one of the heads. These are amazing. What you think it is? Some kind of robot or some kind of weird ventriloquist? But she never finished her thought. The head, a dark-haired man with a short beard, opened his eyes and looked at her. The two held the gaze of the other for a long moment, and then the head began to scream. The scream was high and terrified, and as the other heads woke up, they took up the same scream. The 16 heads began to keen in unison, lifting their voices to the sky as they shrieked and moaned. I could hear the crowd on the other side of the curtain, confused cries coming from the children as the adults began to cry for help. Carol, we have to go! Carol couldn't hear me, though. Carol was screaming as the heads bellowed their rage and fear to the ceiling of our cheap mall. I heard someone coming, the gravelly voice telling them that everything was okay and that they should return to their seats. I knew that voice, and I did not want him to catch me back here. Even at 17, I was still a little afraid of the man in the dark suit, and I'm ashamed to say that I ran for my life. I fled into the mall, hiding in a bathroom for half an hour before finally coming back to find the performance in full swing, as if nothing had happened. I never saw Carol again, but the man and his singing heads never came back either. I never knew why they stopped coming, but I was a little grateful for their absence. The memory of those screaming heads would haunt me for years to come, and I can remember waking up in a cold sweat as I remembered their open mouths and mourning faces. In my dream, Carol was still screaming, and when she looked at me, her head would flop sideways and fall off her neck. In my dream, I couldn't run. All I could do was watch. I hadn't thought about the choir of heads for many years, but I was reminded of them today. I've got kids of my own now, 6 and 13, and I've moved away from the little podunk town I grew up in. I went to college, and now I work in the library of said college. That's where I met my husband, and that's where he proposed to me. We've been together for 14 years, and we couldn't be happier. Anyway, that's not what you're interested in, so I'll get to it. I dragged my kids to a winter carnival that was being held at the fairground. It wasn't a huge event, just a couple of fair rides, some craft tables, some food vendors, but as we got deeper into the event, I began to hear singing. My youngest was interested, thinking it was a local choir or something, and my oldest came along behind in his usual angsty haze. He clearly thought of himself as too cool for something like this, but if he wanted a ride home, he knew that he better keep up with us. I saw the top of the tree before I saw anything else, and the sight of that head perched at the tippy top made me want to scream. Its lips moved as it sang about a little drummer boy, and I was filled with the old fear again. My youngest wanted to get close, thinking the heads were funny, but I scooped him up and told him we were leaving. My youngest cried, not wanting to leave, but my oldest son was up and moving before I was. He was done with the festivities and was glad to see that I was too. We nearly sideswiped another car on our way out of the parking lot, and I was off and running as my kids made various complaints in the back seat. That new head would play a part in my new nightmares. For good reason, too. It would appear that Carol had discovered the secret of those heads the hard way. No one had seen her again after that, and her parents had still been looking for her when I went to college. I didn't tell the police anything, and they never came to ask. I just knew that I'd get in trouble if they found out what we'd been doing, and when the man in his cart had left early that year, I assumed it was a mystery I would never know the answer to. Now I knew better, and I suppose Carol did too. Her head sat atop the tree at the place of honor, singing all the old holiday classics the heads had sung every year. I told the kids to play as I went into my sewing room, just sitting here as I write this little confession of inaction. I've got no idea what to do, and I'm not sure that anyone would believe me anyway. So if you see the tree of singing heads this year, just remember to keep your distance. Otherwise, you might be the new star of their little Christmas special. They had just enough to finish my rapping. I hope that last story was to you guys' expectations, because we've got a few more to come. I'm sure we've all had a seasonal romance or two. I know I haven't. I've been married for way too long for that. But every now and again, they're good for a touching gift. I've always been something of a ladies' man. Ever since my first girlfriend, I've been a firm believer in the love 'em and leave 'em school of thought. In high school, it caused some trouble. I was a handsome football player who went through women like water, and it seemed I was always in the middle of some drama between a couple of gals. In a way, I guess I fed off of it, loving the attention that I got from being at the center of the controversy. As I got older, I found similar conquests out in the real world. The car lot I worked at held a bevy of pretty clients, pretty secretaries, and lovely bosses who became far less authoritarian once the bedroom door was shut. Until today, it had never really gotten me more than a drink thrown in my face, or a need to change my locks and notify security at my condo. That was before I met Maria, though. It happened a few weeks ago. I was drinking at the bar, warming up a pretty blonde on the stool next to me, when she walked in and grabbed the eye of every man there. She took a seat, long legs moving beneath her red dress, mane of black hair falling over her shoulder, and I felt drawn to her somehow. The blonde barely seemed to notice when I left her, almost like she too was taken with this bewitching creature who had wandered into our lives. She smiled at me as I approached, asking what she was drinking as the collective eyes of the crowd fell away from us. She said her name was Maria, and for 2 months I was putty in her hands. She was unlike anyone I had ever met. Smart, confident, possessed of her own upward mobility, and didn't seem to need me in the least. When we made love, It was incredible, like nothing I had ever experienced. That was the first time I thought about just staying with her forever, lying there with her, basking in the afterglow. I began to feel that I could hang up my bachelor life for good. After the third time, I started to get a little scared by this feeling. This had always been my life. I had always been a dog chasing my next bone, and this woman was making me feel things I had never felt before. I began to pull away hard. I soon fell back into my old habits. I started to tomcat around and live the life as I had before Maria. A week before Christmas, she met me in front of my apartment and confronted me. I had been out with someone else. She could probably smell her perfume on my coat, and when she tried to throw that fact in my face, I ended it. I told her it was over. It had been fun, but it was over. She didn't cry. I guess I had expected she would. Instead, she got mad. She slapped me across the face, her red nails cutting my cheek, and I could see some of it dripping from them as she seethed at me. For a moment, her beauty slipped, and she looked more like a wild animal who'd been cornered by a predator. She was furious as she stood before me, and I found myself a little afraid she would simply put an end to me right there. For a moment, she seemed to consider that very thing. "You will pay for this. No one leaves me. You will regret this. You will beg me to take you back before the end. You're crazy. We're through. You have no power over me," I told her. She smiled, and it was an ugly thing on her pretty face. "Is that what you think, mi amor? You will soon find that my reach stretches farther than even you would believe." She was right, I suppose. For the next few days, I seemed to see her everywhere and nowhere. When I was at the bar, at the club, in a hotel lobby, or wherever I was finding new and exciting places to pick up women, I would suddenly feel her close by. I would catch her mane of raven hair from the corner of my eye. I would feel her emerald eyes on the back of my head. I would hear her laugh skate across my psyche, and it would throw me off my game. I was suddenly tripping over my lines, less smooth with my pickups, and I found myself going home more and more often by myself. She seemed to haunt me, dogging my heels wherever I went, and I seemed incapable of returning to the life I had known before. I was returning to my apartment, alone one night, when I saw a package sitting in front of the door. It was December 22nd, 2 days before Christmas, and the sight of a package wrapped in deep red paper, topped with a glossy bow, wasn't really that odd. Someone had seen fit to leave me a present. But who, I wondered? I had no family, no friends to speak of, no girlfriend who might come to give me a gift. I lifted the package and shook it, hearing something heavy thunk around inside. It didn't tick, and it didn't smell like a bomb, so maybe it wasn't a vengeful ex-present. I opened the door and brought it inside with me. I set it on the kitchen table and went to get a shower. My prospects tonight had thrown a drink at me after my line had landed badly, helped in part by Maria seeming to appear in the mirror behind the bar. She had favored sugary drinks, it appeared, and now I was sticky and in sad need of a shower. I threw my clothes in the hamper and switched on the water as I stepped into the building's steam bank. The warmth took me away from my failure, ripped the megrims from my mind, and plunged me into a blissful numbness as the water cascaded over me. I opened my eyes when I heard the soft sound from the living room, but shrugged it off as the heat coming on. I stood under the warm water, letting the stickiness and the burning pockets of alcohol drip to the floor of the plastic tub. I leaned into the deluge, letting it wash away my cares, wishing there was someone to wash my back for me. Some bouncy young thing, her charms on full display, sliding her soft hands over my tense back would be nice right about now. I could almost feel it as I stood there, her strong hands rubbing against my tired skin, her gentle fingers sliding over the knots, her jagged fingernails cutting my skin. I gasped as a searing pain ripped across my left shoulder. I staggered against the wall, feeling the blood run down my back, and realizing it hadn't been my imagination. I put a hand on the wound, my fingers coming away red, and turned my shoulder to the water as I looked around for the source of the cut. My shoulder erupted in white-hot pain as the hot water hit it, but I was more concerned about what I had scraped it against. I looked at the shower curtain, but it was free of anything that could have cut me. I looked at the opposite wall, anything that might be hanging from the ceiling, but I saw nothing. The blood running down the drain, however, said clearly that something had gotten me. Looking in the mirror after I'd gotten out and dried off, I could see 3 long scratches down my shoulder. They looked like nail marks, maybe from an angry or passionate lover, but I shrugged that off at once. I hadn't had a woman since Maria had left. The idea that they could be that old was laughable. The longer I looked at them, though, I came to realize that there had been scratches there not too long ago. Wasn't that the spot that Maria had often clutched with her nails when we were getting heavy? How many times had I looked at scratches just like these, though not as deep, in the mirror the next morning? I shrugged it off and pulled my robe on gingerly. It was a coincidence, nothing more. Maria was on my mind, so of course I was making connections where there were none. I let the warm robe envelop me and went into the living room to see what was in the box. Now that I was less sticky, my curiosity was piqued. When I got into the living room, though, I found the box on its side and opened on the floor. Somehow the box had fallen off the table, and the bow had come undone in the fall, spilling the contents out of sight. I started looking around for what had been inside. The box had been heavy enough to make me believe that the contents were pretty big, but I couldn't find anything. Nothing had rolled under the couch, nothing under the table in the kitchen, nothing in the kitchen itself, and nothing was out of place at all. Had someone come in and stolen whatever was inside? No, I thought after a moment of frantic looking, because the chain was on. No one could have gotten in if the chain was on and unbroken. I did find a card that had been inside, though. A little red card with black writing that made me feel squirmy as I read it, and I thought about Maria again. Merry Christmas, mi amor. May this gift remind you that my reach is farther than you think. It wasn't signed. I balled it up and threw it away. Someone was playing games. An ex, probably. I had many. Most of them were dumb as rocks, and again, that made me think of Maria. This was the sort of thing that she would think was funny, the kind of thing she might think would scare me. Maybe scare me enough to bring me back to her. I turned off the light and went to bed. I lay in bed with my head under the pillow, but sleep seemed to elude me. The scratches on my back burned, throbbing against the covers, and I couldn't help but think about Maria as I lay there. She was never far from my mind these days, since I kept seeing her out of the corner of my eye, or she seemed to loom just over my shoulder. Now this mysterious gift. What did it all mean? May this gift remind you that my reach is farther than you might think. What the hell did that even mean? As I lay there, I began to hear a strange noise from the living room again. I heard something moving around in the quiet of the night, a soft scuttling like a rat or a mouse. I had never had a rodent problem. I was a pretty clean bachelor, all things considered. It was cold, and they were always looking for a warm place to hide, though. I made a note to call the landlord tomorrow so the exterminator could come out, and tried to get some sleep. Now, however, it was the scrabbling that kept me awake. I could hear the rodent in my living room, moving around and exploring my nice clean apartment, and the sound of its little feet was driving me crazy. I could swear it didn't sound like a normal rat. The cadence of its footfalls was off or something, and it just seemed to crawl into my ear as I lay awake. It sounded big, though, that was for sure. I made a note to myself to call the landlord right away in the morning. I did not want this thing making a nest in my house and staying any longer than it had to. When it turned its attention to the hallway, I sat up to make sure I had closed the door. I didn't figure it could get in with the door closed, and I laid down as I tried to get some sleep and ignore the annoying beastie. It would hit the door and go away, hopefully not nesting too deep in my apartment so the exterminator couldn't find it easily. The last thing I wanted was a whole family of rodents in my apartment, chewing up my furniture and leaving droppings on my... When the door creaked open, I nearly jumped out of my skin. How had it opened the door? Had I forgotten to close it firmly? Was the rat big enough to brute its way through it? I heard the little bastard wandering in and hunkered under the covers. Okay, so he was in here. It's not like he could climb into bed with me. I was a big dumb predator, and he wouldn't want to get too close. Rats only came and chewed people's faces off in movies or tabloids. In reality, they were cowards who barely ever bothered people beyond invading their houses and being a nuisance. It would crawl into my closet and probably chew on some of my dirty clothes I had on the floor, and that would be... I felt a tug on the comforter, and shuddered as it pulled its way into my bed. I laid as still as I could, the weight of the thing pressing down on me. It was bigger than I had thought it was, its weight making me think of a kitten almost, and it definitely had more than 4 legs. It scrabbled over my leg, up to my buttocks, and over my back as it made a beeline for my head. This was insane. There should be no reason for it to get this close. Rats did not usually get this close to people. I began to remember these old stories about rats eating homeless people's faces, the victims waking up and screaming as the rat made off with their lips or a nose. Would he come under the covers to look for me? Did I want to give him that chance? I sat up suddenly as it scuttled over my injured shoulder, tossing back the covers and roaring at it like a pissed-off lion. I expected that it would send the little bastard running. It would piss itself all the way to the front door, not expecting a screaming human to be waiting for it. The little asshole had messed with the wrong guy today, and he was going to get more than he bargained for tonight. At the time, my only regret was that I would have to wash the comforter and sleep under an old quilt in my closet when it peed all over itself in fear. I wish that was the limit of my regrets that night. It turned out that it wasn't a rat, and my angry cry turned into a confused scream as quickly as it had started. It had danced back, crouched on the corner of my bed, as the light through the window showed me precisely what had been scrabbling through my house. As my scream died in my throat, we sat and stared at each other, another scream bubbling up my throat as it assessed me from its position of surprise. It was no rat, no mouse either. It was a hand. It looked just like Thing from the Addams Family. The hand was pink, slightly tanned, its knuckles hairy, and the back near the wrist was covered in coarse black hair. It hunkered on the bed, seeming to look at me, and when I screamed again, it lunged suddenly. My screams were cut off as the hand clamped around my windpipe, and I yanked at the wrist stump as I tried to free it. The fingers dug in, pressing into my flesh, and its grip was as strong as iron. Strong or not, it lacked the leverage that a wrist provides, and I soon felt the fingers sliding off my skin as I threw it against the door. It hit the door with a splat, and one of my neighbors yelled at me to keep it down. It rose to its finger legs and seemed to be trying to get its bearings. I had stunned it, and I could see the pointer finger was bent a little after hitting the door. I had to strike now before it got its wits about it, and I scrambled my own hand along the edge of my bed, hunting for the baseball bat I had there. I felt the cold metal of the bat as it came scuttling at me again, and I wrapped my hands around the handle, gaining confidence as I lifted it. It jumped this time, its finger legs bringing it up onto the bed as it prepared to lunge at me again. I waited, not wanting to spook it. It tested its fingers a single time before it sprang at my throat again, looking ghostly in the moonlight as it leapt. I swatted it deftly out of the air, and when it hit the wall, I saw it twitch as its fingers stood at odd angles. I didn't wait for it to get itself together this time. I rolled out of bed, deft as any hunting cat, and swung the bat down on it as it lay twitching. I saw it spasm, blood oozing from the strange thing, but I kept swinging until it was little more than a pulpy flesh wad on the ground. Its blood was black as moonlight, sitting on the carpet like sludge as it clung to the bat like ichor. I was winded when I stopped swinging, and the thing was little more than a pile of meat and bones. I grabbed a gray grocery bag from the nightstand and picked up the pulpy mess. I didn't want it in my room. I didn't want it in my apartment, and I intended to walk straight out to the dumpster despite the hour and throw it away. I would sleep much better once it was gone, and I was suddenly very tired. The adrenaline was keeping me upright, but once it left, the dread and the exertion would lay me out. I opened the door to my room and took a step out into the hallway. I froze, however, as 3 more of the hands came wheeling around the corner, making a beeline for my open door. I slammed it on their non-existent faces, putting my back against it as they banged and smashed. That's where I've been for the last 3 hours. The sun is peeking up now, and the bag sitting beside me has stopped moving. The hands outside are still moving outside the door, though. I can see them if I peek under the door, and my phone's been blowing up with texts for the last 2 hours. They're from her. They're all from Maria. She's been texting me ever since I made the phone call. I had picked up the phone and dialed emergency services at once. How had I not thought of that before? The cops would come in and find the hands, and that would be that. They would kill them or bring this nightmare to an end somehow. I lifted the phone to my head with shaking hands, and when the operator answered, I almost cried. Yes, I need the police here immediately. I have strange creatures in my house that have trapped me in my bedroom. They're trying to hurt me. I need help. Okay, sir, one moment, please. She asked for my address, verified my name, and then began to ask me other things while I waited for the police to arrive. How long had this been going on? What sort of creatures were they? Was I injured? I told her I wasn't hurt, not really, and that I wasn't sure what they were. I couldn't exactly tell her there were disembodied hands in my house. She would think I was crazy, so I lied. Yes, you do, she said, her voice sounding familiar the longer I talked to her. Why don't you tell me what's in your house, mi amor? Maria, I breathed, my breath catching in my throat. Why don't you give up and come back to me? I'll let you crawl back, and we'll put this behind us. You don't want to know what happened to the ones who decided not to come back to me. She cackled evilly on the other end of the phone. I hung up and threw it under my bed, where it continued to ring. I heard it ring again and again, the hand slamming into the door, until she finally gave up and started texting me. I heard it chirp 12 times, 24, 36, before I finally dug it out and started writing this. She kept texting, sending me messages, telling me to give up and just come back to her. I kept swiping them away, trying to ignore them, and 30 minutes ago, she sent her last text so far. See you soon. The hands have stopped banging now, and I can see a pair of shoes standing on the other side of my bedroom door. Someone just knocked, calling my name and telling me to open the door. It appears that Maria has arrived. It appears that I'm out of time. It appears I should have been more wary of my ex's bearing gifts. It appears her reach was, indeed, farther than even I believed. It just wouldn't be the holidays if we didn't check up on a familiar face, would it? I know some of you have asked me about the Green Man and wanted some more stories about him, so let's hear a tale about 56 West Tree. Jeff had been a police officer for the small town of Briar for 6 years. The town had a population of about 7,000, and positioned as they were in the North Georgia hills, he didn't get a lot of tourist traffic like some of the towns in the area. Blair got its fair share of leaf-lookers, people in vans or SUVs who came up to see the leaves and clog up traffic for a few months, but they were usually gone by mid-November, or early December at the latest. They blew away with the leaves, and Blair was left as sleepy and quiet as usual. The town had a Walmart, as all towns do, 6 restaurants, 2 chains and 4 local spots, a hardware store, 2 gas stations, 2 red lights, and a small Main Street area sporting 12 little shops. They had a combination K through 12, and the Blair Thorns hadn't gone past the local division since Clay Jackson took them to state in the late 90s. It was a small town that rarely needed the 4 deputies who assisted Sheriff Whitaker in the day-to-day protection of the town. So, when Jeff got a call about a disturbance out at 56 West Tree, he had no reason to expect anything but local kids, or maybe town drunks. The state had been getting calls all night about the usual drunken revelers, but most of it had been about the strange occurrences at the abandoned farmhouse. At 2046, a neighbor called in a noise complaint from the plot of land that had once been a fruitful field. They claimed to have heard a loud crash from the abandoned farmhouse, and asked if someone would drive by and check on the property. Jeff was on patrol when dispatch had called it in, and he turned his cruiser into the Sip and Slurp parking lot and made his way out of town. The snow was falling again, and the roads were icy, but Jeff had lived here all his life. It was nothing new to him. He knew these roads like the back of his hand. 56 West Tree had been abandoned for almost 5 years. The home was a piece of local legend, and the city council had been debating having it torn down as it slipped further and further into despair. Jeff had gone there many times as a kid. Most kids did, and he saw the old house silhouetted as it sat on top of the hill. He could see the familiar farmhouse with its sagging roof and brittle walls, but there was a new element to the house that Jeff had never seen. The car sticking out of the side of the house, was definitely a new addition. He pulled his cruiser into the front yard, lights training on the car, and he drew his weapon as he stalked towards the smoking vehicle. It was a new vehicle, something sporty and sleek before the collision. Someone had driven their car into the side of the house and made a large hole in the wall. Jeff jumped as his foot came down on something and discovered further vandalism. Someone had also shattered the windows of the old house, an action that seemed petty considering the hole in the wall. The driver was nowhere to be found, and after radioing in the incident to the station, Jeff started searching the scene. He looked through the hole, checking the small room for signs of the driver. The decrepit relic of a house was as silent as the grave, but Jeff was still hesitant to go inside. How often had he and his friends dared each other to go in as they stood at the perimeter fence? 56 West Tree was supposedly the most haunted house in town, and the local preacher had claimed many times that the devil's voice could be heard inside. It was originally owned by the Jafforth clan, a family who could trace their roots back to the town's founding. At least, they could have if there had been any Jafforths left. Town legend was that 30 years ago, William Jafforth had walked into the sheriff's department on a dark and stormy night and laid a bloody axe on the sheriff's desk. He admitted to murdering his wife and children, and when the sheriff went out to the house with his constables, the whole clan had been found dead in their beds. They had each been killed with a single axe blow, and not a soul had woken up during the attack. When asked why he had done it, William said that he wouldn't let another Jafforth die for this town, and would instead drag his family tree up by the roots. He died in prison a few years later, and every family that attempted to live thereafter had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. Jeff's radio keyed up as he stood thinking about the old house's reputation, and scared him near to death. "We'll send a wrecker out there in the morning, Car 3. Get back to your beat and just leave it alone." "Understood," Jeff said, stepping gratefully away from the hole in the wall. As he climbed into his car, Jeff was a little relieved. The place still gave him the heebie-jeebies, and if he didn't have to go into the old farmhouse, all the better. Jeff was just starting his cruiser when a loud groan drew his attention back to the house. The roof was sagging under the weight of all that falling powder, and as he shone the searchlight on his cruiser at the house, he could swear he saw something walk past the upstairs window. Jeff killed the engine and stepped out of his car, his eyes still glued to that window. He squinted as the spotlight covered the window, but the dusty glass was too caked to see much. Jeff reached for the door handle, but let it go again as he turned back towards the house. Jeff had never mustered up the courage to go in as a kid, but if the perp was still inside, maybe even injured or incoherent, he would have to brave the confines of the Jafforth homestead. He stepped in through the hole and into the dusty living room beyond. It was still furnished, and Jeff saw a sagging green couch, 2 armchairs, and a cold TV, all covered in a thick layer of dust. Pictures hung lopsidedly on the walls, and a ballet of dust motes danced and swirled in the beams of Jeff's flashlight. He could see a line of footprints heading towards the stairs, and Jeff drew his gun as he followed them into the velvety darkness. The fact that they were bare with so much snow on the ground lifted the hairs on the back of his neck, and Jeff could see the barrel of his gun jittering as he mounted those steps. The upstairs hallway was long and unfurnished, but he could see that only one of the doors was ajar, and made a beeline for it. Sweeping his gun about, checking his blind spots, Jeff pushed the door and listened to it creak open horror movie fashion. The bedroom was a wreck. It had been small, holding only a single bed and nightstand, but both were shoved over, laying sprawled across what was left of the floor. Someone had torn up the floorboards, and a crowbar lay like a discarded snakeskin nearby. The hole yawned like some skeletal mouth, and whatever had been inside was now long gone. Jeff swung his light around, looking for whoever had moved past the window, and when his foot sank into the floor, he realized that he'd been careless. The edge of the hole had crumbled when he'd come down on it, and Jeff gasped as he sank up to the ankle. His light swiveled fretfully, searching for ambushers, and when he pulled his foot free, he saw that something was stuck to it. Jeff reached down and found the pages of a book stuck to the bottom of his boot. He moved his light down and saw that his foot had come down on the book beneath the floorboards. The book was ragged, the cover moldy and bloated, and the pages on his foot weren't the only ones that had come loose. There were a few pages inside the hole, and as Jeff looked, they appeared to be someone's journal. The ink was old and a little flaky, and it appeared that his boot had ruined the middle part of the journal. As he looked down into the hole, Jeff felt moved to take them, something he had never done in all his time on the force. He couldn't say if it was his subconscious or the voice of the devil, but he scooped it up and slid the ragged thing into his pocket, snatching the other pages too for good measure. When the radio crackled, Jeff jumped like he'd been caught doing something naughty. "Car 3, are you still at the vehicle?" The usual sleepy dispatcher sounded almost frantic, and it made Jeff edgy. He checked in, and dispatch told him to stay with the vehicle and under no circumstances to leave it. The vehicle he had found, lodged in the side of the house, was involved in a kidnapping case the next town over, and they were very interested in finding out where the perp had gone. Backup was on the way, and Jeff needed to sit tight and wait for further instructions. Jeff said that he copied, and headed down so that he could sit by the car until help arrived. He came back through the hole to find the car still lodged in the breach. Jeff took a seat on the cold metal bumper of the vehicle, listening to it click and groan, but as the wind howled and the snow fell, he decided he might be more comfortable in his squad car. As the snow came down, obscuring the windshield, Jeff pulled the moldy book out of his pocket and thumbed through it. The dates inside went back about 120 years and occurred during the founding of the town. The owner talked about leaving their home and traveling to this little piece of nothing. After the move, it was mostly entries about farming or building, but one particular entry caught his eye. December 12th. I had a meeting tonight with the town elders. Honeycutt and Treen want to forego this year's sacrifice. They don't want to build an altar and claim we have other, more pressing things to worry about. More pressing matters. Did we not leave our homes and forego our lots in life so that we could worship as we saw fit? Did we not run into the hills so we could start over? I spoke with the others after they left, and Norwell and Rita want to make an example of them. Perhaps this year we've already found our sacrifice. Norwell. Jeff knew that name. Norwells were big landowners in the area, and Readers owned the library and the land the municipal building sat on. He flipped over to the next day and read about the construction of an altar out in a clearing near a large pool of water. Unless there were many places like that around here, that had to be Harder's Den, a place Jeff had swam as a kid. They had quarried stone there and used it to assemble the altar. This didn't seem weird to any of those involved, and over the next few days of entries, they detailed the preparations for a sacrifice. Jeff had never read anything in the town histories about sacrifices before, and the idea that they'd been held in a place he'd gone to as a kid was a little frightening. The rest of that month was full of talk about winter storms and heated arguments between the elders, culminating in a chilly entry on December 24th. December 24th. Treen came to me last night and offered documents that implicate Honeycutt in sabotage. He attempted to undermine the altar, would see it unworthy of the Green Man when he comes. As such, his family now stands as sacrifice. My son William doesn't understand. He and Masha Honeycutt were very close, but he'll understand the reason in time. When something pollutes your crop, you draw it up by the root so it doesn't poison the field. I can hear their screams as I write this. He has found them. Jeff was shaken out of his reading as the blue and whites approached. 2 town cop cars were sailing up the driveway, followed by 6 state troopers in a black town car that might have been FBI. Jeff stepped out of the cruiser, laying the book on the seat. The town car had 4 other town cops, the sheriff included. He pulled himself out of the cruiser, the wheels groaning a little as his weight left the seat, and he walked over to Jeff. He pumped his arm in a single motion, asking for a report on the situation. Jeff told him about the car, showed him how it had been wedged in the side of the house, and explained that the driver, or whoever they were, had been nowhere to be found. As they spoke, Jeff couldn't help but notice the man in the black suit as he stepped gracefully out of the sedan. As they trundled into the snow, breath steaming in the cold, the man organized them into groups and told them to get moving. He wanted the house searched from top to bottom, asshole to appetite, but when Jeff went to help, he called him to the porch instead. He wanted to know what Jeff had seen, and Jeff hesitated as he thought about the book. Suddenly, Jeff felt an urge to hide its existence, but shook it off at once. He was an officer of the law, and if the book could help their investigation, he needed to tell him. He grimaced as he handed him the moldy old thing, but skimmed it over as the cover left stains on his leather gloves. The man's face grew severe. "Have you read this?" "Some. First 10 pages or so. Sounds like a journal, sir. I figure it's Jafferth's, the family who used to live here when the town was first founded." "Does it say anything in here about sacrifice? Maybe even a green man?" Yeah, it does. How did you... Been following this case a while, kid. Where does it say their altar is?" "It sounds like it's down at Harder's Den. It makes sense. Harder's is only a mile or so into the woods that way. If they had a spot out there, it would be easy to get there from here, and they could..." The man nodded as he called inside. The stomping of boots preceded them, and as they arrayed on the porch, the sheriff was red in the face from exertion. He asked if the blustery old man knew the spot the book talked about, and the sheriff nodded as he pointed up the road. He set the book down with a thump, looking up the road where the sheriff had pointed, and Jeff could see the excitement, plain as day, on his face. "Excellent. Let's go. We can still catch them if we hurry." He turned to the assembled men, looking at each as he spelled out what they were going into the woods to do. "Listen up, 'cause I want total silence once we're in the woods. This man has a kid with him, and he's getting ready to sacrifice him to some make-believe bugaboo. He's nuts, but he's not stupid. Keep your eyes open, and be ready to mow him down if necessary. I'd hate to lose the kid, but this guy has killed 10 people in the last 5 years. I'll be damned if I let him escape. Sheriff Critch, you stay here with the vehicle and let the officer come with us," he said, pointing at Jeff as they prepared to go. Sheriff Critch was monstrously fat and pushing 60, but he seemed to bristle at the idea of being left behind. He didn't like wandering through the woods under the best of circumstances, but he certainly didn't want to be left behind, so some wet-behind-the-ears rookie could take all the credit. He glowered at Jeff, and the younger officer didn't need to ask. He'd worked with Sheriff Critch long enough to know that he would not stay here while the most significant case of his career happened around him. His next words saved Jeff's life, though he doubted the sheriff knew it. "I've come this far, Agent Reinfield. Let me finish this up with you." Reinfield grinned at him, and Jeff suddenly hoped that he would ask him to stay behind. That grin looked ghastly. "Very well, then. Lead the way to Harder's Den. You, stay here with the vehicles," he said, and he pointed at Jeff. "We'll radio if we run into trouble. Here, keep this safe until I get back." He pressed the journal against Jeff's chest, and the shaking officer had little choice but to take it, as the men ran back to their cars. With that, the expedition set out towards the woods, and Jeff watched from the porch as they disappeared into the trees. As he stood on the porch, the wind blew against him, cutting right through his thick police-issue jacket. Jeff decided to climb back in his cruiser, the car cranking after a few tries as the heater drove away the chill. He opened the journal to the page he'd left off and thumbed through the entries after the first sacrifice. It was mostly town meetings, growing records, and stockline reports, but amongst them were prayers to the Green Man for a beautiful harvest, or graven images scratched into the page so they might never be erased. The town began to grow up around the collection of farms, and some of the founders moved their families into town to set up shops and establish a community. The Jafforths continued to live in the farmhouse on the outskirts of town, and a year after their first sacrifice, there was another. December 24th. Treen seemed shocked when the mark appeared on his door. A lot of people seemed shocked, but they needn't have. Treen was a traitor and a naysayer. He invited that minister into our community, invited him to establish a church here, and just expected the rest of us to go along with it. Nay, the man must go. We'll drag him and his whelps from their beds if we must. We will pull them up from the root and stem and have an end to Treen and his ilk. The fires are stoked, and the altar is built. Tonight, he comes for his sacrifice. Who was him, Jeff wondered. Who was this Green Man the book mentioned earlier? The Green Man they spoke of was a mystery to him. Jeff had lived in the town his whole life and had never heard of this Green Man. If he was a throwback to times gone by, then why was there no mention of the Green Man in town history? Maybe this was one of those things they wanted swept under the rug, Jeff thought, and read on. The radio crackled, dispatch looking for updates, and Jeff checked in, telling dispatch he was still at the farmhouse. Someone from the woods checked in as well, letting dispatch know they were still in pursuit and making their way through the woods. As dispatch copied, Jeff returned to the journal, finding that the start of the 3rd year was a little more turbulent. February 4th. The town prospers, I suppose, but our way of life is in jeopardy from those outsiders. When we came here, 10 families looking for a place to worship and be free. It was so we might draw strength from our shared faith. Now this minister, Reverend Lundgren, has established a church and drawn a flock. The farmers and settlers from the nearby area have come into the town and fallen under his spell. As his influence grows, he believes he can hold some power here. Curse Treen, curse the man to the soil. He invited the man here, and now he's burrowed in like a mole. Even some of our own have fallen to his poison religion. More the fool they. There is but one God, and he is green and terrible. Mayhaps we will see, come winter, whose God is the stronger. The next few months were clouded with shadows of war between the church and the Green Man followers. The Reverend Lundgren, a figure Jeff had read about in town history, preached venom against the pagans and their earth religions. He called them profane, the foolish ideas of uneducated man, and by autumn only 6 of the town elders were still among the Green Man's fold. All of them had lost a member of their family to the flock, as they preached of love and life everlasting, a much more hopeful message than the bleak teachings of the Green Man followers. The writer's words became barbed and filled with threats the farther Jeff read, and the cold wasn't the only thing that made him shiver. August 1st. As I smelled the air this morning, I could feel his power rising. Every leaf upon the tree says burn me in his honor. Every plant in the field hopes to be laid upon his table this Thanksgiving. Every drop of blood within my body cries out to be used by him, and I am powerless to disobey. The 5 of us, Moore, Rita, Critch, Norwell, and myself, have met to discuss what must be done. Clades, Dykes, North, Gobbler, and Jockaroo have betrayed us, and it is from their homes we shall draw our sacrifice this year. Willing or not, pure or not, we will have our vengeance upon those who have wronged us. Reeder and Moore have returned to their homesteads, and though Norwell abides in the town, he has moved his family back to his farm so that more of them may escape the taint of Lundgren. There is war coming, a war of faith, and I pray that we are all resolved to it. September and October went by uneventfully, but when October came, there was indeed a bounty. October 4th. Gobbler has returned to our folds. He claims that his leaving was for information gathering, and we pretend not to know what we have known since the 2 of us were children in the woods. Garrus Gobbler is a weak vessel full of fear, and I feel sure that even Lundgren knows it. He does bring news, though. Lundgren fears they who worship in the woods. He thinks us pagans, Gobbler claims, or maybe Odinists. To Lundgren, though, any religion not his own smacks of hellfire, and he has lumped us in with those who worship Satan, as though my lord were not a mailed fist that men cringed to mention when that red imp was still upon the tit. I've been at thought lately about this year's sacrifice, and I believe I have the perfect one. Perhaps it's time that Lundgren was properly welcomed to the community. Car 3, do you read? Over. That was Terry Knorr. Terry and Jeff had gone to high school together, and though they hadn't run in the same circles, they were brothers in blue now. Jeff keyed up the mic and copied, and Terry asked if he could see the fire from the farmhouse. Jeff got out of the cruiser and looked towards the woods, realizing that he could see a fire. His mouth hung open as he climbed back in the cruiser to radio the fire department. If left to its own devices, that fire could burn down the whole damn forest. He had reached for the knob so he could turn it to the right frequency, when Terry asked him again if he could see it. "I see her, Terry. Do you want emergency services down there to put it out?" "Negative, it's contained. I just wanted to know if you could see it. Damn near burned my eyebrows off from a mile back. Over." Jeff laughed and told Terry that he copied before hanging up the mic. He was a little jealous of Terry, off in the woods with the sheriff while Jeff was watching the vehicles. Jeff supposed that Terry had seniority since he'd been with the force since the two graduated high school. Besides, Jeff thought as he picked up the book again, this was starting to get good. The old book creaked again as he opened it to the spot he'd left off on, and as Jeff read on, he realized that things were about to get worse. December 1st. North tried to come to the harvest celebration yesterday, but we turned him away. His son, Jensen North, is with us, and wouldn't even look at his father or family when they arrived. He did speak to his oldest brother before he left, and I feel we'll have a few more Norths before the year's end. I will not charge the children for the sins of the father. The green man draws only the loyal to him after all. North tried to warn me before he left, telling me that Lundgren knew what he was planning, and if there was to be a fight, then the priest would fight. I invited him to tell his false savior that we too would fight, but only time will tell if a fight is needed. There was some weird static on the radio, but it went dead pretty quickly. Jeff looked at it for a few minutes and then got back to his book. December 15th. We've chosen our sacrifice. Her loss will bring fear to the flock and make the old man look weak. We will take her on the 23rd. Let them look for her if they will, but her bones will belong to the green man. Agent Reinhold here. Does anyone copy? His voice was hushed and whispery, and Jeff made his low too as he keyed up the mic and told him to go ahead. We have a visual on the suspect and the child. We're fanning out to capture. Maintain radio silence. We will advise when we apprehend the suspect. Then the radio went dead, and Jeff clicked the double-click break so that they would know he had copied. Then he turned back to the book. The next few entries covered Jafferth and his allies as they planned the abduction. This particular Jafferth was firm in his convictions, but not so subtle as he maybe should be. It appeared that he had misstepped at some point, because the entry on the 24th contained none of his usual snarling bravado or religious sureness. His entry on the 24th sounded downright scared. December 24th. All is lost. We're surely dead. They found our altar, found us as the wind was rising, and his horse was approaching. They came from the woods with crosses raised and scriptures called aloud and proud. It all died when they saw him. When his horse walked from the woods, his antlers on full display and his axe raised, the ire was in his voice, and they ran like rabbits. We ran too, all of us separated in the storm, but I managed to bring most of mine home before they froze to death. Mama, Jesse, William, Fawn, David, and I now locked inside and huddled in the basement as the blizzard surges around us. I know not what became of Raymond or Cass, but I trust that they are safe or in his legion now. As for the other elders, I pray that they've made it away safely. As for our enemies, I pray that they taste the full brunt of his fury. The next entry was dated January 2nd, but as Jeff turned the page, the radio erupted in sounds of gunfire. Dispatch, dispatch, send help to Harder's Den. We've been ambushed. Officers down. Weapons hot. Shots fired. Repeat, shots. But the radio abruptly went silent. Jeff sat in the car, his shivering having nothing to do with the cold. What had happened out there? Were they okay? Whoever had been on the radio said officer down, which meant wounded, or dead. Jeff had started to leave the vehicle when dispatch called him over the radio. Be advised, do not leave the vehicle. Do not enter the woods alone. Wait for backup to arrive. Do you copy car 3? Jeff wanted to tell dispatch that he copied no such thing and head into the woods as fast as he could, but he knew she was right. If Jeff rushed into the woods, he wouldn't do anything but get himself killed. He sat down, little as he wanted to, and waited for the blue and white lights he knew were on the way. Jeff's eyes strayed back to the book again, but he dared not pick it up. This was no time for distractions. Jeff didn't need someone sneaking up on him while his mind was elsewhere. But as the minutes spooled out, he grew weak. Jeff felt his hand stretch out for the book, and when he opened it, he saw what came next. It appeared that there was a little more town history to be gleaned from this journal. January 1st. The blizzard has stopped. The winter lord, in all his anger, has finally blown himself out. Now we see what is left. Critch and Rita have come to see us, my Cass having spent the last few nights with the Reader clan. He didn't come back alone either. It seems my clan is to be joined to Reader's. Cass spent the last 8 days with Shemia Reader, and now, come spring, the two wish to be wed beneath the green boughs. The Moors came next. Choctaw Moor had perished in the storm, but his brother Eustace has taken the clan, and Choctaw's wife as well. As for the Norwells, only the patriarch survived. In time, he may raise a new family, but only time will tell. January 2nd. We returned to town today and found the wrath of the Green Man had been for them as well. The niece of Lundgren, Charlene McNeil, is safe, but her uncle has been lost and may never be found. His flock has come about her, holding her as a sort of saint, and as we approached, she had the sense to parley. Now we work out terms of inclusion. Jeff heard something and glanced up, eyes cast back towards the woods. He expected to see a small horde of green barbarians creeping up on him, but there was nothing to see. He wondered what had drawn his attention, and only then realized what it was. The fire had gone out. It was a lot darker out there without the towering light that had graced the woods, but as Jeff stared into the white forest, he realized he could see something. The trees were swaying, bending as something got closer to the house. It was moving through the woods, bending trees as it came, and before his eyes, Jeff saw tendrils of frost creep across the glass. The snow had been falling in a sluggish pattern, but began to pick up as the frost gathered. Suddenly, something hit the side of the cruiser and rocked it on its shocks. The force smashed the side of Jeff's head into the door, and as he fought to stay conscious, he heard a blizzard roaring outside. Jeff tried to crank the car, meaning to leave despite what dispatch says, but it wouldn't start. He pushed the door, knowing better than to go out in a blizzard, but was helpless as claustrophobia crept over him. The door, however, refused to budge. As the storm raged around him, Jeff hunkered down in the cruiser and massaged the side of his head. It wasn't too bad, though the bruise would definitely hurt the next day. He wondered if this is what the Jafferth clan had felt as they hunkered in their cellar and listened to the storm rage outside. That thought brought him back to the book, and he reached for it with trembling fingers as he tried to find his place. The name Charlene McNeil made him very interested to see how it ended. Charlene McNeil was another of the town founders, someone every kid learned about in school when it came time for local history. She had helped to unite the town, been its first mayor of sorts, and helped to unite the townies with the faithful. There was a picture of her on the mural of Town Hall, and a bronze statue of her outside the courthouse, but none of that was what had piqued Jeff's interest. He was curious because she also had the distinction of being his great-great-grandmother. January 5th. They have seen the might of the Winter Lord, felt the ire of the Green Man, and now they believe. We have come to an understanding that they may stay in town and worship their God as they choose, and we may own our land and worship our God in the field and farmland. We will bring our harvest into town, and they will buy our food and lay by for winter. We will allow them to stay, and they will provide us with a sacrifice on the 23rd of December. The mark shall be left upon the door of their house, as it was in times gone by, and one shall come forward to be sacrificed. Thus it is, and thus it shall always be. As the dome light flickered and the battery died, Jeff read on, though he didn't need to. It was all a matter of family history. Charlene McNeil and William Jafforth, the oldest Jafforth male, had fallen in love and courted secretly. When William's father discovered them, he cast his son out, and he went to abide in the town forever after with his God-fearing wife. He had taken her name instead, and a rivalry existed between McNeils and Jafforths forever after. It had held until the last Jafforth had seen the mark upon his door, and knew that his fellows had betrayed him and sought to punish him for his impurity. The Jafforths had begun to try to repair the damage of their past. He had been trying to reconcile with the McNeils, Jeff's family, and for this they had been punished by those in the farmland. William Jafforth, named for Jeff's great-great-great-grandfather, had decided that he would rather see his family dead than give any of them over to the madness of his so-called neighbors. Jeff was too young to remember any of this, and none of his clan ever spoke about the Jafforths if they could help it. They were a stain upon the family tree, and Jeff's father had always told him to be careful around the families from the farmland. You'll be hated by them, for both the Jafforth side and the McNeil side. Best to keep your friends in town and leave the farmers to their crops. As Jeff lay huddled on the seat of the cruiser, his jacket drawn up around him, he heard his father's words rustle like dead leaves in his head. Jeff suddenly felt that he was very likely to die here. He didn't know what had suddenly brought the blizzard here, what had suddenly put the pieces of family history in his hands, and even why he had stayed after the gunshots. But Jeff felt as if it was all bringing about the end of his life. As the ice and snow blew around the car, something that suddenly didn't feel so secure, Jeff shook his head and kept himself awake. You would have to have said that would be impossible, but Jeff began to feel very sleepy as the cold settled around him. Jeff felt sure that this would be the end as he slipped off. As he lay shivering, he wondered if he'd see Hedda when he got where he was going. The thought did nothing to warm him, and it occurred to him that it was the first time he had thought about his sister in years. Hedda had disappeared in the woods around Christmas time, too. Jeff slid off into a dream of his younger sister, the one who had disappeared when he was 12 and she was 10. She was always 10 years old in his dreams, her corn silk hair flying freely around her face as she tried to keep up with her older brother and his friends. Hedda had been spirited, a trait the women of their family often shared. She was utterly fearless, not prone to the squealing many girls found when they were presented with snakes or frogs. In his dreams, he saw her standing in the yard of this very house, looking at the same window that he had seen the shape in earlier tonight. It was the last time he had seen her, and the image was frozen in his mind forever. Jeff had always been too scared to go into 56 West Tree when he was a kid. He had been afraid that his great-great-great-grandfather's ghost would find him and punish him for the sins of his family. His friends, boys who may or may not have known his lineage, always teased him for being a scaredy cat, but no amount of teasing could ever get Jeff to go into that house. Just standing outside that house, Jeff could almost feel how much it hated him. He would no more have gone into 56 West Tree than he would have cut off his own thumb. However, there was one person who always said they would go inside. They had done it many times. None of the boys would dare say a thing to her. She was one of them. She could do and say anything that they could do 1,000 times over. Hedda, who had disappeared into that house when she was 10, was just as tough as any of the boys. Jeff remembered how they had all been daring each other to go in, telling each other they were cowards if they didn't. After all, Jeff's little sister would go in there, so why wouldn't he? Jeff and his friends had been murmuring, booing each other up to go in, and when Hedda had spoken up, all four had jumped a foot. "You big babies, let me show you it's not so scary." She had looked up at the window before going in, just like she had always done in his dream. When she had gone missing in that house, the whole town had turned up to search the woods for her. Well, the townies had at least. Most people thought she was just playing anyway. Hedda, who felt more at home in the Jafforth house than she ever did in the brick two-story they'd grown up in. Jeff jerked awake as the door was wrenched open and was blinded by the snow that blew into his face. He reached for his gun, unsure who or what had opened the door, but it was none other than Terry Knorr. Terry was a mess, but he still smiled at him as Jeff took him in with disbelief. Terry looked like he'd fallen into the swimming hole. His hair and face were muddy, and his uniform was smeared with mud, or maybe blood. Despite this, Terry seemed in fine spirit. He shook his head, dousing his smile down to a line on his mouth, and clicked his tongue at Jeff. "Now, I'm not sure if I should keep such a man on my force, I tell you what." Jeff let a smile stretch across his face as he wrapped the man in a bear hug. Friend or not, it was nice to be reminded that there were still people out there. "Well, aren't you a sight for sore eyes? Your force, huh? Better not let Sheriff hear you talking like that." Terry's face became serious, his glee melting like the snow. "Critch is dead, McNeil. He caught a bullet from one of the state boys and went down hard. If it hadn't been for her, I don't think any of us would have gotten out alive." He nodded behind him, and out of the shadows stepped a tall, robed figure with a mop of blonde hair and a half-crazed smile that seemed likely to split her face in two. Jeff had already gotten out of the car when the woman scooped him into a hug. Jeff went rigid, feeling like a rabbit that's been caught by a hawk. She held a definite aroma of woods about her, and when she released him, she brought her face very close to his. Jeff stared into those half-crazed eyes and was surprised to discover that he knew her. Hadn't he just been thinking of Hedda? Hedda smiled at him. "Happy Yule, brother. I've been out about his work, and I'm back now. And we have much to catch up on." A small group of grubby officers came staggering out of the woods behind her, Agent Reinfield hanging limply between the two of them. He was bloody, but seemed to be breathing. Jeff could see half his face was burned, a long, angry swatch of skin, and the men holding him seemed as elated as Hedda. Jeff looked back to his sister, her pale hands holding a long, cruel knife as she held it out for him to take. "It's time for you to do your part, Jeffrey. It's time for the Green Man to have his sacrifice." Reinhold lifted his head a little, begging Jeff for help, but Jeff hardly felt he had any choice. He could hardly take 4 full-grown men or his feral-looking sister on his own, and with each step, Jeff felt sure that this was the right thing to do. Reinhold struggled, but he had come to the same conclusion as Jeff had. After all, Jeff thought, as he slid the knife across the agent's throat and let his blood patter onto the snow, it was in his blood, wasn't it? "I think one more story ought to do it. Then all the presents should be tucked beneath the tree with care and a certain amount of wrapping to them. We all know the song on what we received for the 12 days of Christmas. Well, let's hope that your 12 days are a little less traumatic than these. So now, in closing, we hear about the 12 days of Christmas." December 12th. We were getting ready for school when Aaron found the fire truck. It was a big one with an adjustable ladder and small hoses that spooled and unspooled as needed. There were 2 firefighters in the front seat in full gear with their axes in hand and their respirators on tight. Aaron rushed over to the tree in a wild excitement as he started zooming it around the room. I saw something fall out of the back compartment then and flutter to the ground. I figured it was from my dad, Aaron's grandfather, who had been a strict disciplinarian turned soft old grandpa in his old age. I picked it up and opened it. There was a message inside, and it was short and a little cryptic. "To remind you of the first time you strayed. S." The first time I'd what? That was clearly not meant for Aaron. The truck was, but not the note. What was my dad talking about? The first time I'd strayed from what? As I sat and watched Aaron zoom the truck around the living room, though, I suddenly remembered. The first time I'd strayed. The first time I'd been unfaithful. Reggie and I had only been dating a few weeks when Kevin moved into the apartment next door. He was something. 220 pounds, a solid, muscled fireman, and he had only had one look at me in my short skirt and crop top before he'd been forced to look away. It took me a few weeks to muster up the nerve to bring some cookies over for him and his roommate, and they had had plenty of time to cool as I I flipped the card over to see if there was anything on the back before I crumbled it up and put it in the garbage. My dad had always been a bit of a religious. I guess it came with the territory when you were a minister, but this was going too far. How did he even know? I'd only ever told one, well, maybe two people about Kevin, and he wouldn't have been able to talk to either one of them. Maybe I'd told Mom, I decided, and figured I'd just let it pass. We were living in their rental house, after all, and I didn't want to mess anything up between us. I should have said something there and then, though. December 13th. We got home from school. Aaron found a play school tool belt complete with hammer, saw, and screwdriver. It hadn't been there when we left for school, so I figured it was another surprise from Dad. I set about making dinner as Aaron went around, pretending to fix this and that with his new tools. I didn't give it much thought until he brought me another small note that he'd found in the pocket of the work belt. "It must be yours, Mommy," he said in a childish treble. "I can't read." And then he went back to playing. Great, another sermon from my father. This one was short, too. To remind you of the handyman who was oh so handy. S. That would be Jim. Jim was our handyman. Reggie had hired him to fix the place up when we'd gotten married, since he was too busy at work to do his own repairs. The house had been a gift from Reggie on our wedding day. His parents had left him a small fortune after they died, and he had found a new house for his new wife. He'd been working long hours back then, 12 and 16-hour days, but Jim had been more than happy to keep me company and keep me warm when Reggie was at work. I threw this one in the trash, too. My anger clouded my mind, or I might have suspected something even then. Who the hell did my dad think he was? Leaving gifts for Aaron and chastisement for me? I had probably told Mom about Jim, too. There was that time when Mom liked to live vicariously through me and my little dalliances, but I couldn't believe that she would tell my prudish father about all these indiscretions. I made a mental note to talk to him and went back to making dinner. I still hadn't grasped the depths of what was going on. December 14th. The police car came next. I was trying to coax Aaron out of his pajamas and into his school clothes. He was having a bad morning, and he'd slept poorly the night before because of the wind. To speed him along, I had suggested that maybe we could see if Grandpa had left another present under the tree today. He got dressed quickly after that, but he laughed and said it wasn't Grandpa leaving things under the tree. "It's Santa, Mommy," he said, as though I was slow not to get it. "Santa leaves toys under the tree." "Of course," I said, pulling on his sweater. "It must be Santa. He's rewarding you for being such a good boy throughout the whole endeavor." "What's an endeavor?" he asked. He was always so curious. "It's just a hard time, honey. Let's go have a look and see if we left you anything while we eat breakfast and get ready for school, okay?" The police car was sitting right in plain sight. There was another note, of course, and this one was preachier than the last. "To remind you of the policeman who gave you more than a ticket. S." My freaking mom had been running her mouth again. I didn't even remember this one's name, but he'd been so cute on his little motorcycle. He had gotten me for speeding, and I had been. But a flash of the girls and a promise to let him put his handcuffs on me had gotten me out of that little jam. We'd spent a hot hour or so in the back of his squad car, and off I'd gone about my day. When I'd caught pregnant a few months later, Reggie and I had been trying after all, but Aaron did have the cop's sandy hair. I called my parents' house, but no one answered. Dad must be out early, maybe shopping with my mom or something, and I decided to call them that night. I'd had enough of Dad and his high-handed notes and his little spoiling gifts. I had never had a good relationship with Dad. What we had now was grudging love on my end and a father trying his best to support his straying daughter kind of love on his. I would tolerate being in his debt, but I wouldn't tolerate his judgmental ways. I wish now I'd maybe tried a little harder. December 15th. When we got home from school that night, I found the football with a note taped to it. Was he worth it? S. Aaron loved football, of course, but I didn't love the memory it brought. Derek was young, still in high school, and I'd seen him and his friends playing football in the street. From the moment I'd seen him, I'd wanted him. He had long blonde hair, he was built like a professional linebacker, and when he smiled, you could see all the carefree love of life that exists in someone who hasn't had their dreams smooshed back in their face yet. He was going to LSU, he told me, as he lay naked under the covers on my bed. He was going to LSU and he was going to be a football star. He'd get drafted by some pro team, and maybe he'd even take me with him. I was the best lay he'd ever had, after all, and being with him had made me feel 16 again. Not a 30-year-old mother who'd never quite lost all the baby weight and knew she wasn't as sexy as she had been once. Didn't Reggie tell me so? Not with his words, but with his actions, with his lack of affection, with his lack of attention. I had liked it. I had liked him. I didn't like this note. I tried to call Dad again, but their home phone went to machine. It was 8 o'clock at night, for God's sake. Where the hell were they? Didn't old people usually go to bed early? I'd call him in the morning, I told myself. I'd call him and put a stop to this. If he wanted to give Aaron toys, he could wait until Christmas like a normal person. This needed to stop. December 16th. That morning, I found the straw that broke the camel's back. There was a children's craftsman workbench in my living room, bristling with tools and little building projects, and Aaron ran to it like a kid on Christmas morning. He put on the hard hat and went to get his tool belt so he could get to work, but I was already searching for the note. Where was it, Dad? Where was today's sermon? I already thought I knew what it would say, but I needed to see it, needed to read it. I nearly tore it in half opening it when I found it in the tool bench's little cubby. You just couldn't help yourself, could you? You needed seconds. S. Jim had gotten in touch with me after Aaron was a year old. He said he thought about me often and wanted to see me again. Reggie was at home more now, liked to spend time with the baby, so I had gone to book clubs or got a gym membership so I could get out of the house for a while and feel less stir-crazy. These trips were always to a nearby hotel, so Jim and I could rekindle our relationship in private. After 3 sweet weeks, he told me that his wife wanted to try and work things out, and I never saw him again after that. I did tear the note in half after I'd read it. I called my parents' house in a blind rage. Dad picked up on the second ring, and he sounded like he'd been awake for hours. I could hear Mom puttering about the kitchen in the background, and before he spoke, he swallowed a bit of whatever he'd been eating. I could see Mom now as she cooked his breakfast and ironed his clothes, and he just sat at the table and wrote his sermons and got ready for another day of being retired. Good morning, sweetie. Is everything okay? Did the wind do any damage last? You know perfectly well that my house is fine, Dad. I want to know why you keep leaving these little notes and toys under my Christmas tree. I was angry. I was fuming. And I was expecting some high-handed religiosity about being sure your sins will find you out, or polluting the garden of your marriage with strange seeds. But I got none of that. What I got was confusion. Toys? Sweetheart, I haven't been over to your house in about a week. Not since we watched Aaron, so you could go to that office party. We went to see friends out of town. We left Monday night, remember? We only just got back last night. I saw that you'd called, but it was so late that I didn't bother calling you back. I shuddered, my blood running a little cold as he said it. Put Mom on, I breathed. Sweetheart, I don't Put Mom on the phone, I shouted. I must have startled him, because I heard the phone fall out of his hand and hit the linoleum with a hard thump. Someone picked it up, and I heard quiet chatter on the other end. My dad's concerned, gruff voice, and my mother's softer, more consoling tone in answer. She was always the peacemaker, always the Kissinger, always the one who soothed things over. Honey, what's wrong? Is Aaron okay? Did you guys really just get back from a trip? You really haven't been here all week? There was a heavy pause, and then, yeah, we left to see friends. We told you that, dear. We told you we'd be gone for a few days. Is everything okay? You sound very... Have you told Dad anything about what we talked about? About my slips from the path a proper woman should take? That's what we always called them. We used the term in tones of deepest sarcasm, but we'd always called my sexual adventures by that name. I would call Mom up and tell her in a mournful voice that I'd slipped from the path that a proper woman should take, and she would tell my father that she needed to take this in the bedroom, and then ask for details as she got her thrills vicariously. No, she said, and I could almost hear her look at Dad. Never, dear. Did something happen? I hung up on her. Aaron and I stayed at home that day and didn't answer the door. I made a trip to Walmart after lunch and picked up a new lock for the door that I installed. If Dad really was playing games, something I was beginning to doubt, he would have to knock first before he played them. December 17th. The little suit came next. It was Saturday, and Aaron was up early to watch cartoons. I told him to make a bowl of cereal and not make a big mess on the floor. I didn't hear any squeals of joy from the living room, so I figured that there was no secret surprise today. I went back to sleep until about 9, and then got up, my own stomach beginning to rumble, to see what I could find to eat. I dropped the eggs on the floor when I looked into the living room and saw what was hanging by the fireplace. It was an expensive, coal-black suit for a child of 6. Aaron was less interested in it, but it didn't need a note to tell me what this one was for. I found one anyway. It was stuffed in the breast pocket, and as I unfolded it, I already knew what it was likely to say. Nothing was sacred to you, not even my job. S. I had slept with Reggie's boss about 6 months after Jim had stopped calling. I couldn't tell you why I did it. I did it because I could, I guess, and his boss just looked so good in his Armani suit. Our fling was passionate, but burned out fast. 3 months in, and he traded me for a newer model, a secretary with high breasts and well-formed backside, and I sulked off into the distance. Tongues must have wagged about the office, though, because this was the first one Reggie had found out about. He hadn't accused me of it. He'd simply asked me why people were saying that I was screwing his boss. I'd admitted to it, and instead of raging or throwing me out, he had hugged me and said he was sorry for not giving me more attention. He said he wanted us to go to marriage counseling. He said he wanted to be a better man, the kind of man that I deserved. I made another trip to Walmart and bought a flip lock for the door. I also bought locks for the windows and a chain for the back door. I considered a selection of guns in the sporting goods section, but I decided against them. Aaron was young and curious, and if he'd gotten hurt with one, I don't know what I would have done. Dad came over while I was installing things and asked what was wrong. I told him I'd seen someone around the property and was just being careful. He asked if I wanted to borrow a gun, and I told him no. I didn't want one around Aaron, and I was sure that it was nothing. He shrugged and invited me over for dinner later if I wanted. Then he walked back to the house through the field as he always did. I had lied to Dad. I wasn't sure that it was nothing, and became less sure that it was nothing with every day that passed. The note read, "My job." Dad wouldn't have signed it like that. Only one person would have signed it like that, and that person was currently in a padded room somewhere, eating his meals through a tube and screaming himself to sleep. Reggie couldn't be out, and even if he couldn't find us. He couldn't. December 18th. The gift was a costume. Aaron liked costumes. All children like costumes, but this one was exceptionally telling. I was getting ready for church, a job made all the harder thanks to Dad and his Pentecostal ways, and when Aaron jumped out in the red devil costume, I thought I was going to drop dead of a heart attack. I had dressed him about an hour ago. He only had an hour before he tried to ruin his clothes out of sheer little boy curiosity, and when I came into the living room, I saw them thrown haphazardly over the couch. I'd been trying to put in an earring, and the sight of all those children's clothes scattered about made me so mad that I dropped the back. It rolled under the couch, of course, and as I bent down to get it, I yelled at Aaron to come put these clothes back on and hurry up or we'll be late. When I stood up, there he was, red devil costume and pitchfork held high, as he yelled, "Boo!" right in my face. I fell, tearing my dress and scuttling backwards on my butt as the apparition loomed up before me over the couch. He laughed then, fit to split, as my gran would have said, and pulled back the hood to reveal that it was just him. He climbed in my lap and gave me a kiss, my stunned face and overloaded body too keyed up to respond, and said he'd found it under the tree. Santa had brought him a costume for next Halloween, probably because he had missed it this year, and it was so cool and neat, and I barely heard him. I just picked him up and put him in his room and closed the door. The note was lying on the floor next to the tree. Aaron must have thrown it there in his haste to have the costume out. I bent down slowly, and with shaking hands, I picked it up. It was the same notes I'd been getting for the last 6 days. Simply, write your own message notes on a plain white envelope, and I almost dropped it as I opened it to see what my Secret Santa had written this time. A Halloween treat to go with your Halloween trick. S. We'd been in marriage counseling for about a month when I realized that the problem was not my husband. Reggie felt that he was working too much, that he was too focused on his job, that he wasn't an attentive enough husband, and that my cheating was just my way of showing him the error of my ways. He was too hard on himself. I had been kind of a floozy since before we met, but the therapist had showed me something that maybe I hadn't wanted to admit to. The problem wasn't Reggie. The problem was with me. Halloween night, and I was on candy duty. Reggie had taken the night off, and he and Aaron, now 2, had gone out trick-or-treating. He had asked if I wanted to go. All of us had dressed as devils, which I just knew my dad would love when he got the pictures, but I had said no. I told them I was having cramps or some other woman problem, and made my excuses that I'd just slow them down. So off they went, Daddy Devil in his long red cloak and horns, and Baby Devil toddling along at his hand, and Mommy Succubus was free to prowl. Like the cop, I didn't even know his name, but he too was dressed like a devil, and when he sent his kids up the way to keep trick-or-treating, I let him feel a little of my hellfire right there in the entryway. He left with a treat, and so did I. You see, the problem wasn't Reggie. The problem was that now and then, I just liked a little strange. We didn't leave the house that day. The phone rang, but I didn't answer it. Dad came by to see where we were, but I didn't answer the door either. He yelled a little bit when his key wouldn't open the lock, but eventually he left, and I went back to staring off into space as Aaron watched movies on his old VHS TV. He wore the costume, even though I hated it, and before bed that night, I triple-checked the locks and even put a chair under the door. I needn't have bothered. It didn't do any good. December 19th. There was a remote-controlled speedboat and another note. So you remember your time on the water. S. I had met the man with the speedboat while we'd been at the lake house. He was tan and fit, and he'd been watching me sunbathe all day. When he invited me onto his boat, I asked, coyly, if he didn't think his wife would mind. He said he really didn't care, and I found that I didn't either. His boat hadn't been the only thing to go fast, though. We stayed home again, and I made another trip to Walmart. I changed the locks again and bought a camera system for outside. December 20th. We stayed home again after I found a doctor's outfit under the tree. Did you enjoy your weekly doctor's visit? S. Dr. Klein had been my gynecologist for years. His seduction was the easiest of all, and he knew his way around my body better than I did. He dropped me as a client afterwards, but at least he didn't tell anyone. I always thought that was decent of him, more decent than I deserved. I spent the day going over the camera footage. It was a night vision model, so I knew I'd be able to see anyone creeping up at night, but in the hours of spooling through the footage, I found absolutely no one. Not a deer, not a raccoon, not a prowler, not so much as an exceptionally large moth. Aaron was starting to notice that something was wrong, but I told him that Mommy was sick and I needed him to go play so that I could feel better. I found him asleep on the floor of his room, still in that awful devil costume, and trundled him to bed before taking up my vigil on the couch. I stayed up all night that night, sitting in the living room and drinking wine from the bottle. I must have dozed off after I finished the bottle, because when I woke up, December 21st, there was a briefcase under the tree with the initials RF on a gold plate. I looked at the clock on the mantelpiece and back at the briefcase. I had been asleep for no more than 30 minutes, and in that time someone had come in and left this thing here. I got off the couch and crawled over to the briefcase on my hands and knees. My head was swimming and my heart was pounding, but I needed to see what was inside. I knew who RF was. Randall had been our family attorney and had even been my counsel during the trial, and I was afraid of what I would find inside the briefcase. The combination was put in already, Aaron's birthday, and when I clicked it open, I had to stifle a scream. Inside was a note and a gold signet ring that also had RF stamped on it. The ring was covered in dried blood. I'd counsel you to think about your many sins. S. Randall had been a family friend for years. We'd gone to the same school, the same church, and known many of the same people all our lives. I knew he had a crush on me. He had a crush on me since Sunday school, and I suspected I might need him in my corner at some point or another. When I'd invited him to my bed, you'd have thought Christmas had come early. He was an adequate lover, enthusiastic if not well equipped, and by that point, Reggie had begun to suspect that therapy wasn't working. He'd go right on suspecting it for another year or two, before he finally had his breakdown. I called Dad then. It was the middle of the night, and I expected to find him groggy and grumpy, but for some reason he was awake. He said that something had been nagging at him for a few days, and he'd gotten up to have a glass of water and read his Bible when I'd called. I called him over to the house right then and there and told him everything. I told him about my cheating. I told him about how my marriage had imploded. I told him about why Reggie had gone crazy. I told him about the gifts and the notes and everything that terrified me, and he took me in his arms and calmed me down. We reviewed the footage from my new cameras, and after a few hours, he too could find nothing. He left for a few hours, and when he came back, he had a sleeping bag and a .38 in a holster. Your mother's going to watch the house for a few days while I stay here. We'll catch whoever's sneaking into your house, hon. Never fear. I wish he'd been right. December 22nd. Dad woke me up at 4:30 a.m. and told me to come have a look at this. I'd been startled awake as he shook me, and I detached myself from Aaron and pulled on my house coat as I went into the living room. I'd brought Aaron into my room to sleep. It certainly made me feel better, if nothing else, and he'd wound himself around me in that way that children always seem to. I'd been dreaming of Reggie. Reggie also had his way of constricting me in the night as we cuddled, and in my dreams he'd turned into a big snake that was squeezing the life out of me. He'd struck at my face just as Dad had woken me up, and I'd probably startled Dad with the violent way I came awake. As I came into the living room, I could see Dad's sleeping bag beside the couch. It was rumpled and looked like he'd come out of it in a hurry. He pointed to the fireplace, and I saw a wrapped box sitting there with a neat card attached to the top. Dad said he couldn't have dozed off for more than an hour, and when he'd woken up, the box was just there. It was a big box, wrapped in holiday paper and topped with a bow. The card looked spooky, almost skeletal, and as I took it, I had already figured out that this present wasn't for Aaron. This gift was for me. We told him how we felt, but how did he make you feel? S. He was talking about Dr. John. Dr. John had been our counselor for 3 years before I finally pulled him off his high horse. I'd had to tell him every one of my dirty little secrets, and I could tell that over the years he was getting more than interested. He was the one that listened. He was the one who was there. And what he lacked in the looks department, he made up for in experience. I opened the box and immediately dropped it with a throaty scream. It fell sideways, and a pair of arms fell onto the fireplace. They were starting to gray a little, but they were still recognizable. They had been hacked off at the elbows, and they were covered in coarse black hair that ran halfway up the hands. Dr. John had been possessed of very hairy arms, and even the backs of his fingers had little black hairs on them. They didn't have to be his arms. They could be the arms of any man. But I suddenly knew that they were his. I knew how the person knew who all my lovers were, too. John had probably been happy to tell him, if it might save his own life. He told Reggie that we were sleeping together, after all. I burned them outside in a burn barrel, and despite my dad's objections, I did not call the police. December 23rd. There was no package that morning. Dad was up and making coffee when I awoke, and he handed me a plate of eggs and said it had been a quiet night. He asked if I minded if he went home and got some sleep. I said I didn't care and promised to call him if anything happened. He left me the gun, telling me to keep it out of Aaron's hands, and left through the field back to his house. I wish I'd said more to him. I wish I'd told him I loved him, but it's too late for that now. Aaron and I had an almost normal day. We ate breakfast, watched TV, and even wrapped a few gifts for Mom and Dad, as I sat with Aaron and watched Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Frosty the Snowman tell their tale for the 1,000th time. There was no school to call out from. School was on break until the first of the year, and Aaron and I just enjoyed a nice, quiet day at home. Around 5:30, I realized I needed tape to finish wrapping. We got into the Range Rover and went to the store a few miles up the road. Mom and Pop stores were closed up, but the chain stores were usually open this time of year and could be counted on not to close until Christmas. I got some stuff for dinner, the tape, some more wrapping paper, and wished the bored-looking clerk behind the counter a Merry Christmas as Aaron and I went back to the car. I stopped in the parking lot as fine white snow began to fall all around us. Aaron laughed and danced in excitement, catching the snow in his mouth and jumping around as children do in the snow. The wetness fell around me, but I was lost to it. I had eyes only for the Range Rover, for the windshield, for the monstrous lump that sat in the front seat and grinned at me menacingly from behind the steering wheel. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But there it sat like a cancerous sore on the front seat of the SUV, mocking me. A Christmas present with a familiar white card. Aaron was sullen the whole way home. "I want to open the present, Mommy," he whined, as I slid through the deepest snows and tried to call my parents' house again and again. "It's for me. It's from Santa." "No, Aaron, this present is for Mommy. I'm just sure of it," I said with false glee. The phone in my hand rang and rang and rang again. Why weren't they answering? Surely they haven't gone out now. Dad must be awake. I needed them. For what felt like the first time in my life, I needed him, and I had a sick feeling in my guts that I'd never see either of them again. Aaron and I pulled up in front of their house, and it sat dark and still. 5:30 should have been prime time for my parents. Dinner to eat, paperbacks to read, crosswords to complete, Mom's knitting needles clicking away, and the darkness inside made me feel sure of what I already knew I'd find. "It looks scary, Mommy," Aaron said, and I agreed with him wholeheartedly. I didn't want to take him inside. I didn't want to go inside at all, but I knew I couldn't just leave them in there. I unbuckled his seatbelt and took him by the hand, and we walked inside the dark house where I did not want to go. The door was unlocked. It opened on oiled hinges and gave out none of that creepy funhouse squeal you always hear in the movies. The living room fire was out, and Mom and Dad's easy chairs looked like crouched ogres in the darkness. I flipped on the lights, and the cheery Christmas tree lights blinked into illumination. The overhead lights didn't come on, and as we walked in, I heard glass snap under my boots. The naked light that hung from the ceiling fan had blown, or had been broken, and in the twisting light of the Christmas tree, we made our way to the kitchen. That's where we found Mom. She'd been doing dishes when someone had come upon her, and she hung out of the sink like a rag doll. She'd been drowned. Someone had held her head under the soapy water until she stopped breathing, and now she slumped in the sink like a woman taking a nap. Aaron stepped back, asking what was wrong with Grandma, but I turned him away from the grisly scene and off towards my parents' room. Dad was in there. Someone had cut his throat. I closed the door and took us to the guest room. That was where I opened today's present, the box I had taken from the Range Rover. The box contained a broken pair of glasses and a tweed coat that was drenched in blood. I sobbed as I saw them, knowing immediately who they belonged to. Samuel had been the love of my life. He was a professor of literature at the local community college, and I'd been taking his class as a lark. He was old enough to be my father, but the smell of pipe smoke and old books that hung around him made me feel safe. He was a generous lover. He would have made a better father to Aaron than Reggie could ever have, and I'd been preparing to leave Reggie for Samuel. I never got the chance. Reggie had caught us in bed together. There had been no time to excuse or apologize. Reggie had shot him in the chest 6 times, and then he turned the gun on me. He dry-fired it another 6 times before realizing it was empty. Reggie had let the gun slip out of his fingers, tears streaming down his face, and simply sat down to wait for the police. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't cursed. He just went limp and waited. 2 months later, he was in a psychiatric facility, and I was moving into my parents' rental home. Now they were dead, and I was left with nothing. Aaron pulled on my arm, and I could tell that he was crying. Well, not nothing, I guess. December 24th. I had meant to leave that very night, but when I went out to the Range Rover, all 4 tires were slashed. Ditto on Dad's truck and Mom's van. I locked the doors and stayed awake all night, waiting for him. No presents appeared. No one came to bother us. And now it's midday on Christmas Eve, and I've finally done what I should have done a week ago. What I should have done when I got the box with the freaking arms in it. The dispatcher didn't seem to understand what I was saying at first, but he finally understood that I'm in the house with 2 bodies and a jacket that is likely murder evidence of some sort or another. I'm waiting in the guest room for them, running my hands over Aaron's duck fuzz of blonde hair. He's asleep, thank God, but I don't know how much longer he'll be able to sleep. The police will have a lot of questions, and I'm sure they will have many for him. I never received Reggie's 12th gift, and I don't think I want to. The wrapped box on the hood of my SUV has been there since morning, but the snow has covered it now, and it's little more than a lump of white. Reggie set out to give me a gift I'd never forget, and he certainly accomplished that. I'll never forget how terrible a human being I am, and how little I deserve the love of the boy that's now sleeping on my lap. Reggie managed to do what years of counseling never could accomplish, and for that, I guess I owe him some thanks. I'm all stranged out for the rest of my life, however long that might be, and if you're reading this, then I ask you to feel no pity for me. My 12 gifts have been well received, and the message was clear. I can see him in the front yard now, waiting for me to come out and get my gift so he can give Aaron his Christmas present. The gift of being free of me. And that will just about do it for us today. I do hope you've enjoyed our extended holiday comfy horror with me, Dr. Plague. I also hope we'll see you tomorrow for more great tales. Until then, this is Dr. Plague signing off. Have a wonderful day and a spooky holiday season.